We are told it was a mistake of nature. We are told that the Hapsburg Jaw, that grotesque, jutting deformation that plagued the most powerful royal family in history, was simply the result of unfortunate genetics. They married their cousins, and this was the price. That is the safe version of history. That is the lie they want you to believe, but if you look at the private journals of the royal physicians in 1661, the story changes. They didn't describe a deformity. They described a container. The jaw of King Charles II didn't just grow too large, it was pushed outward. It was forced open from the inside. For centuries, the Habsburgs ruled Europe, but they were not ruling alone. There is a reason the king could not chew his own food. There is a reason he could not close his mouth. It wasn't because the bone was too big. It was because something else ... needed the room ... This is the truth the king buried ... Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The noise of the modern world fades away, replaced by the heavy silence of stone corridors and the scent of beeswax candles burning low. The light is dim here. The air is cool. We are traveling back to the heart of the Spanish Empire, to a room draped in velvet and shadow, where a secret is waiting to be born. Relax your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Let the darkness of the past wrap around you like a heavy, warm blanket. We are safe here, merely observers in the gallery of time. The year is 1661. The place is the Royal Alcázar of Madrid. Outside, the wind howls across the dry plains of Spain, but inside, the palace is holding its breath. To understand the jaw, we must first understand the silence. The Spanish court was known for its rigid etiquette. It was a world of black silk, stiff collars, and absolute quiet. A place where a glance could destroy a reputation and a whisper could end a life. In this suffocating atmosphere, the birth of an heir was the only thing that mattered. The empire needed a son. The Hapsburg line, which stretched across the known world, was thinning. It was fragile, and on a cold November day, the sun arrived. Charles II, the long-awaited savior of the dynasty, but when the midwives pulled the infant from the womb, the celebration in the birthing chamber died instantly. There was no cry of joy. There was only a sharp intake of breath, followed by a long, terrified pause. The child was ... wrong. Historical records, the ones you find in libraries, will tell you he was a sickly child. They list his ailments like a shopping list of misery: rickets, fevers, soft bones. But the private letters sent from the Austrian ambassadors back to Vienna tell a darker story. They speak of the king's face. The lower part of the infant's face was not just misshapen. It was dominant. The mandible jutted forward so aggressively that it seemed to belong to a different creature entirely, grafted onto the skull of a human child. The tongue was too large, filling the oral cavity so completely that the boy could barely breathe. Let alone nurse. The royal physician, a man named Dr. Pedro della Torre, wrote in his personal ledger a book that was later ordered to be burned, though fragments survived that the jaw felt dense. He noted that when he touched the infant's chin, it did not feel like bone. It felt warm. It felt like it was humming. Imagine being there in the flickering candlelight of the nursery. The heavy tapestries on the walls dampened the sound of the storm outside. You are standing over the cradle of the most powerful child in the world. And you see it. The mouth that hangs permanently open. The eyes that seem to gaze at something invisible in the corner of the room. The wet nurses were terrified of him. They claimed that when the room was silent, when the fire had died down to embers, they could hear a sound coming from the crib. Not the crying of a baby, not the soft breathing of a newborn. but a wet, clicking sound. Like whetstones rubbing together. It came from the mouth. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, was a woman of iron will. She was a Hapsburg herself, familiar with the curse of her bloodline. She had seen the protruding jaws of her father, her uncles, her cousins. She knew the look. But this was different. This was the curse amplified. She ordered the mirrors in the nursery to be covered. Heavy black cloth was draped over every reflective surface. Ostensibly, this was to protect the child's eyes from the glare. In reality, it was because she could not bear to see the reflection of what lay inside the cradle. As the years passed, the boy grew, and the jaw grew with him. But it didn't just grow in proportion to his body. It outpaced him. By the time Charles was 4 years old, he still could not walk. His legs were brittle sticks, unable to support the weight of his own history. But his head was massive. And that jaw, it became the center of his existence. He could not chew. The teeth of the lower jaw stood inches in front of the upper teeth. They never met. Food had to be mashed into a paste and spoon-fed to the King of Spain like a bird feeding a hatchling. He swallowed whole, choking, gasping, his eyes watering with the effort of simple survival, and yet, despite this frailty, he survived. This is the first great mystery. Doctors predicted he would die within weeks, then months, then years. Every fever that should have killed him burned itself out. Every infection that should have stopped his heart seemed to hit a wall. It was as if something within him was refusing to let the host die. The court whispered that God was preserving him. The deeper shadows of the palace whispered that something else was preserving him. Let us walk through the corridors of the Alcázar now. Picture the stone floors cold beneath your feet. The walls are lined with the portraits of his ancestors. Philip IV, Philip III, Charles V. If you look at these paintings, really look at them, you see the progression. The jaw gets larger with every generation. It is a slow-motion invasion of the human face. In Charles II. The invasion was complete. There is a specific incident recorded in the secret correspondence of the French ambassador that gives us a glimpse of the horror. The king was 7 years old. He was being tutored in the library, a vast room filled with the smell of dust and old leather. He was a slow learner, struggling to speak because of the tongue that filled his mouth. The tutor, a Jesuit priest, was trying to teach the king to pronounce the name of God, Dios. The boy tried. His jaw worked furiously, moving up and down, side to side, grinding in that wet, loose socket. He made a sound, a guttural, strangled noise. And then, for a brief second, the tutor saw it. He saw the tongue lift. Not the human tongue, but something underneath it. A dark, muscular movement in the back of the throat. A second shift, the priest recoiled, knocking over a stand of ink. The black liquid spilled across the floor like a dark omen. The king simply stared at him, his mouth agape, drool pooling on his velvet collar. The eyes were blank, innocent. But the mouth? The mouth was a dark cave that went down too deep. The priest was dismissed the next day. He was sent to a monastery in the Pyrenees where he took a vow of silence. He never spoke again. What had he seen in the throat of the king? The official story is inbreeding. The coefficient of inbreeding for Charles II was 0.254 higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. Genetically, his genome was a disaster. His body was a map of recessive traits collapsing in on themselves, but genetics explains the weakness. It explains the infertility. It explains the soft bones. It does not explain the survival. It does not explain the specific architectural nature of the jaw. If you study the cranial structure of Charles II, as modern forensic anthropologists have done using portraits and busts, you notice something disturbing. The mandible isn't just long, it is hollowed. The bone density in the chin is remarkably low, as if the bone had been eroded from the inside out. Why would the bone erode? Unless something was nesting there, as Charles entered his teenage years, the bewitched king became a recluse within his own palace. He hated the light. He hated the heat. He spent his days in the cool, damp crypts of the Escorial, sitting among the tombs of his ancestors. He said the dead were quiet. He said the dead didn't stare, but the servants who cleaned his chambers reported strange things. They found raw meat hidden under the king's bed. Not cooked venison or roasted boar, but raw, bloody strips of beef. The king had no teeth to chew such things. He could barely swallow soup. So who was eating the meat? And then there was the chewing at night, when the palace was asleep. The guards stationed outside the royal bedroom reported a sound. A rhythmic, wet grinding, click, squish, click, squish. It went on for hours. It sounded like a dog gnawing on a bone. But when they opened the door to check on the king, he would be fast asleep, his mouth propped open by the sheer weight of his chin, his breathing ragged and shallow. If the king was asleep. What was chewing? We must consider the possibility that the Hapsburgs knew. We must consider that this was not an accident but a transaction. The Hapsburg family rose from minor Swiss nobility to the masters of the world in a shockingly short amount of time. They acquired kingdoms not by war, but by marriage. Bella Gerna to Felix Austria Nuba, let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. They married themselves, over and over again. They turned their bloodline into a closed loop. A circle. Occultists will tell you that a circle is a containment field. If you want to keep something pure, you close the circle. If you want to trap something, you close the circle. What if the inbreeding wasn't an attempt to keep the blood royal? What if it was an attempt to keep the blood compatible? Compatible with the entity that had attached itself to their lineage centuries ago. An entity that fed on power and in return granted it, but every parasite needs a host. And every host eventually degrades. Charles II was the end of the line. The host that could no longer hold the weight of the bargain. The jaw was the physical manifestation of this pact. It was the throne of the entity. By the time Charles was 20, he looked like an old man. His hair fell out. His skin was translucent. He was often seen pressing his hand against his jaw, wincing in pain. As if something was pushing against the nerves, the royal court was in a panic. The king had no heir. If he died, the dynasty died. And if the dynasty died, what happened to the thing they were keeping? They brought in doctors from all over Europe. They brought in exorcists. They brought in Alchemistes. One of these men was a shadowy figure known only as Dr. V. He came from the misty alleys of Prague, a city known for its golems and its magic. Dr. V was granted a private audience with the king. He spent 3 hours alone in the chamber with Charles. When he emerged, he was pale. He was trembling. He refused to take payment. He packed his bag and left Madrid that very night. Riding hard for the border, years later, a letter was found in a drawer in Prague. It was addressed to no one, a rambling confession of a terrified man. In it, Dr. V described looking into the king's mouth with a speculum, a tool to hold the jaw open. He wrote, "It is not a bone. I looked down the gullet of the monarch, and I saw the second set of eyes. They were small, ancient, and milky white. They were embedded in the throat, looking up at me. The jaw is not a deformity. It is a drawbridge. We are deep in the story now. The rain is still falling outside the Alcázar. The king is pacing in his room, the raw meat hidden beneath his bed, the silence of the crypt calling to him. But the true horror was yet to come. The king was about to get married, and the poor, doomed woman who would share his bed had no idea what was waiting for her in the dark. The shadows are long, and the candle is burning low. We have seen the cradle, and we have seen the boy. But the man and the monster are just waking up. To understand the end of the empire, we must look at the king's wife. And we must look at what she found on the pillow next to her. On their wedding night, the year is 1679, the frantic search for a queen had begun. The reasoning was simple. If the king was a monster, perhaps a beauty could save him. If the blood was corrupted, perhaps fresh blood could cleanse it. Enter Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was the niece of Louis XIV of France. Young, vibrant, beautiful. She loved to ride horses, she loved to dance, she loved the sun. When she was told she had to marry Charles II of Spain, she wept. She wept for days. She reportedly cried out, "The Catholic king is so ugly as to cause fear, and he looks ill." But queens do not have choices. They are currency. She arrived in Madrid in a carriage draped in gold. But as she stepped out into the courtyard of the Alcázar, the silence returned. She was led to the king. Charles was waiting. He was 28 years old now, but he looked 60. His legs were so weak he had to lean against the table. And the jaw had settled into its permanent, grotesque state. His mouth was a gaping cavern, saliva constantly glistening on his chin. When Marie-Louise saw him, she did not scream. She was royalty. She knew her duty. She curtsied. But the ambassadors watching noted that she turned a pale, sickly green. The wedding night is lost to history's official records, but the whispers remain. The servants who stood guard outside the bridal chamber heard the king weeping. He was apologizing. Over and over again. Perdonum, perdonum. Forgive me. And they heard Marie-Louise ... praying, not the joyful prayers of a new bride, but the desperate, rhythmic prayers of someone afraid for her soul. The next morning, the queen looked different. The light had gone out of her eyes. She never rode horses again. She rarely danced. She became a ghost in the palace, wandering the halls, always looking over her shoulder. What had she seen? In her letters to France, which were heavily censored by Spanish spies, she wrote in code. She spoke of the cold presence in the bed. She wrote that the king burned with fever, yet his skin felt like ice. She wrote that when he kissed her, she felt no passion, only a strange, vibrating hunger, and she wrote about the jaw. It moves when he sleeps, she wrote in a letter that was intercepted and never sent. It clicks. It seeks. I wake up in the dark and I see his silhouette against the window, and his mouth is open so wide that it looks like the entrance to hell, and I hear ... the whispering, but his lips do not move. The tragedy of Marie-Louise was that she genuinely tried to love him, or perhaps she tried to save him. She fed him when he couldn't eat. She wiped his chin. She became his nursemaid more than his wife, but the entity, the parasite, did not want a nurse. It wanted a successor. 10 years passed. No child. The pressure on the queen was immense. The court blamed her. They said she was barren. They said she was cursed. But the doctors knew the truth. The king was incapable. His seed was as watery and weak as his blood. The biological machinery required to create life had been consumed by the thing keeping him alive. And then the queen died. It was sudden. A pain in the stomach after eating oysters. She died screaming, twisting in agony. The official cause was appendicitis or poison. But the rumors. The rumors said she had been drained. When they laid her out for burial, she looked like a husk. Her youth, her beauty, her vitality all gone, absorbed. Charles was devastated. He collapsed. For days he lay on the floor of his chamber, clutching her portrait, howling like a wounded animal. But amidst the grief, there was panic in the court. The king was still alive, and there was still no heir. They married him again, immediately, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was different. She wasn't kind. She was ambitious. She looked at the king not with pity, but with calculation. She brought with her a new kind of darkness. The exorcist. By the late 1690s, Charles II was decomposing while still alive. He was deaf. He was nearly blind. His digestive system had shut down. He was a walking corpse. The church decided that medicine had failed. The problem was spiritual. The king was possessed. This began one of the most disturbing chapters in royal history. The exorcism of the king, Father Mauro Tenda, and a team of inquisitors took control of the king's body. They believed that demons were blocking the king's fertility. They subjected the fragile monarch to brutal rituals. They starved him to purify his blood. They forced him to drink holy water mixed with the ashes of saints. The king, in his delirium, began to speak. Under the pressure of the exorcism, the barrier between the man and the parasite broke down. The king began to voice the thoughts of the thing inside him. The inquisitors recorded the dialogue. They asked, "Who is inside you?" The king replied, his voice changing, dropping an octave, resonating in that cavernous jaw. "The one who waits." "The one who was promised?" they asked. "Who cursed you?" And the king said, "No curse. A debt my father signed the paper. I am the payment." He spoke of the abomination of the blood. He spoke of the Pact of Vienna. He screamed that his body was a cage and the door was rusting shut. The queen, Maria Anna, watched all this with cold eyes. She wasn't trying to save him. She was trying to steer the succession. She was manipulating the dying vessel to sign a will that favored her family, but the entity would not be manipulated. As the year 1700 approached, the end drew near. The 18th century was dawning, the age of enlightenment was coming. But in this dark room in Madrid, the Middle Ages were dying a slow, agonizing death. Charles demanded to be taken to the pantheon of the kings in the Escorial. He wanted to see the bodies of his ancestors. He ordered the tombs opened. Imagine the scene. The dying king, supported by two monks, standing in the torchlight of the crypt. The marble lids are pushed back. He looks at the rotting corpse of his father, Philip IV. He looks at the dust of his grandfather. He touched the remains. He wept over them. Witnesses said he whispered to the corpses, "I am coming. I am the last." The circle is closing. When he returned to Madrid, he took to his bed for the final time. The death of Charles II was not peaceful. It was a violent separation. On November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day, the king began to convulse. His jaw locked open. His eyes rolled back so far only the whites were visible. The room filled with the smell of sulfur and decay. The doctors tried to bleed him, but no blood came out. Only a clear serous fluid. The parasite had drunk the well-dried. At 2 p.m., the king let out a final strangulated gasp. His body arched off the bed, held up by invisible strings, and then collapsed. The Hapsburg dynasty in Spain was dead, but the story does not end with his last breath. The most terrifying part, the part that confirms everything, was the autopsy of Charles II, is one of the most famous and baffling medical documents in history. It was performed by the court physician, Dr. Juan de Cabriata, along with a team of surgeons. They wanted to know what had killed him. They wanted to understand the failure of the body, what they found defied. Biology. Dr. Cabriata's report is not written in the dry language of science. It is written in the language of horror. He wrote, "The heart was the size of a peppercorn." Think about that. The heart, the engine of life, had shriveled to a tiny, hard black knot. It had been consumed. He wrote, "The lungs were corroded. The intestines were rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water." His head was full of water. When they sawed open the cranium, that massive, deformed skull, they did not find a healthy brain. They found a skull cavity filled with fluid. The brain itself had atrophied, shrunk down to a fraction of its size. If the heart was a peppercorn and the brain was gone, what had been driving the body? What had been walking, talking, and signing decrees for the last 10 years? The fluid in the skull suggests that the king had been dead for a long time. The thing operating the machinery of Charles II was not his brain. It was something else, something that lived in the fluid, something that lived in the jaw. The physician noted one last thing: a small, calcified growth at the base of the tongue, a bony structure that looked like a hook or an anchor. It was the hitching post, the place where the parasite had latched on. They quickly sewed the body back up. They did not want to look anymore. They filled the coffin with spices and lead to contain the smell and, perhaps, to contain the energy. The War of the Spanish Succession broke out almost immediately. Europe tore itself apart, fighting over the empty throne. The world moved on. The Habsburgs lost Spain. The Bourbons took over. The bloodline was broken, but in the Escorial, in the deep crypts where the kings sleep, there is one coffin that is different. Visitors to the royal crypt today report a strange sensation when they stand near the tomb of Charles II. The air feels colder. Some claim to hear a faint, rhythmic clicking sound, click, squish, click, the sound of a jaw that never truly closed. We look at the portraits of the Habsburgs and we see ugly men in wigs. We laugh at their vanity, their incest, their folly, but we are missing the tragedy. Charles II was not a fool. He was a prisoner. He was a biological sacrifice made by a family that wanted power so badly they were willing to breed a monster to hold it. He was the last host. And when he died, the entity didn't disappear. It just lost its ride. It is waiting for another bloodline foolish enough to close the circle. Waiting for another family to prioritize purity over humanity. So tonight, as you lay your head down, be grateful for your flaws. Be grateful that your blood is mixed, that your lineage is a river, not a loop. The darkness of the Alcázar is far away now. The candles have burned down. The king is asleep in his lead coffin, and the silence has returned to the palace. Close your eyes. Let the image of the jaw fade into the mist of history. You are safe. The door is locked. The circle is broken. Sleep now. The past cannot touch you here. Sleep. Asterisk. They call it a masterpiece. You can see it hanging in the Prado Museum today. The portrait of Charles II in the Hall of Mirrors. Critics talk about the brush strokes, the use of light, the melancholy in the king's eyes. They praise the realism, but they don't know what realism is. Because if I had painted what I actually saw in that room, if I had put the brush to canvas and captured the true anatomy of the king, they would have burned me alive in the Plaza Mayor. You think a portrait is just oil and pigment? No, a portrait is a stare. To paint a king, you must look at him. You must stare at him for hours, days, weeks. You see the pores of the skin. You see the moisture in the eyes. You see the pulse in the neck, and I saw the pulse in the jaw. It wasn't a muscle spasm. It wasn't a twitch. It was a slither. I was the court painter. My job was to make the monster look like a man. But one afternoon, in the dead silence of the Alcázar, the man fell asleep in his chair. But his jaw stayed awake. I saw it shift. I saw the bone rearrange itself under the skin like a separate living thing trying to get comfortable. The king wasn't moving. But the king's face was, "This is the truth the king buried." And the truth I painted over. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The air grows heavy with the scent of linseed oil, turpentine, and the dust of centuries. We are stepping out of the glare of the modern world and into the dim, amber light of the 17th century. Imagine a high-ceilinged room in Madrid. The windows are tall, draped in heavy velvet to control the fierce Spanish sun. Dust motes dance in the single beam of light that cuts through the darkness. It is quiet here. So quiet you can hear the settling of the stone walls. Relax your mind. Let the silence of the studio wrap around you. You are no longer in your bed. You are standing in the shadow of an easel, watching the slow, meticulous work of history being made. To understand the horror, we must first understand the artist. His name was Juan Cargo de Miranda. He was a man of shadow and light, the successor to the great Velázquez. To be a court painter in the Spanish Empire was a position of immense privilege, but also immense danger. The court painter sees the king as no one else does. The ministers see the crown, the generals see the commander, the queen sees the husband. But the painter? The painter sees the flesh. Carrego was a man of truth. He believed that art was a mirror. But when he was commissioned to paint Charles II, the last of the Hapsburgs, he realized that the mirror had to be broken. The year is 1680. The king is 19 years old, but his body is ancient. He sits on a velvet chair in the center of the studio. He is dressed in black, the color of the court, which makes his pale, translucent skin look like parchment paper. The sessions were long. The etiquette of the court forbade conversation. The king sat. The painter stood. The only sound was the scratch of charcoal on canvas and the wet slick of oil paint. Being mixed on the palette, Carrego would mix his colors carefully. Lead white for the skin, ivory black for the shadows, vermilion for the lips, but the lips were the problem. In his private diaries, which were never found but whose contents have been whispered about in art circles for 300 years, Carrego described the difficulty of capturing the king's mouth. He wrote, "The architecture of the face is impossible. The mandible does not hinge where a human mandible should hinge. It hangs loose, suspended by ligaments that seem too thick, too ropey. When I sketch the underlying structure, the geometry fails. The jaw is not attached to the skull in the way of natural men. It floats. Imagine standing there, brush in hand, trying to make sense of what you are seeing. You are a master of anatomy. You have studied skeletons. You know how the masseter muscle connects to the cheekbone, but on Charles, the muscle didn't connect. It bypassed the cheekbone and went ... deeper. The king would often drift into a stupor during these sessions. His health was frail, his energy low. His head would loll back against the velvet cushion. His eyes half-dashed closed. It was during these moments of vulnerability that Corrego saw the things that kept him awake at night. Usually, when a person sleeps, their face relaxes. The tension leaves the muscles. The mouth might open slightly, but with Charles, the opposite happened. When the king's consciousness faded, the tension in the jaw increased. Corrego noticed that as the king's breathing slowed, the lower jaw would stiffen. It would jut forward, straining against the skin. As if testing the elasticity of the flesh, the painter would freeze, his brush hovering inches from the canvas. He would hold his breath, afraid that even the sound of his inhalation would wake the monarch. He watched. He saw the skin beneath the lower lip ripple. Not a twitch, a ripple. Like a snake moving under a bedsheet. It traveled from the chin along the jawline, back toward the ear. A slow, deliberate undulation. Corrego told himself it was a trick of the light. The flickering candles. The fatigue of staring at one point for too long. The mind plays tricks in the silence, but then came the sound. The studio in the Alcázar was acoustically perfect. It was built to carry the sound of lute music for royal entertainment. So, in the silence, every noise was amplified. Corrego heard a click. It came from the king. It was the sound of bone hitting bone. Or perhaps tooth hitting tooth. But the king's mouth was open. His teeth were not touching. Corrego stepped closer. He feigned the need to adjust the drapery behind the king. He moved softly, his shoes silent on the rug. He was now only 3 feet away from the sleeping sovereign. The smell hitting him was overpowering. It was not the smell of unwashed bodas. The king was bathed daily in rosewater. It was a metallic smell, like copper, like blood that had been left in the sun. And underneath that the faint, sweet scent of rot. He looked into the king's open mouth. The tongue was swollen, pressing against the bottom teeth. But behind the tongue, in the shadow of the throat, there was movement. The little piece of flesh that hangs at the back of the throat was vibrating, but not with the rhythm of breath. It was vibrating with a frantic, buzzing energy, like the wing of an insect trapped in a jar. And then Corrego saw the eyes, not the king's eyes. The king's eyelids were heavy. Half shut, the pupils rolled up into his head, but deep in the throat, past the swollen tongue and the darkness of the esophagus. Something glistened. 2 small, wet points of reflection. They caught the light of the studio window. They were not human eyes. They were too far apart. They were set into the tissue of the throat itself. Corrego gasped. He couldn't help it. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. The king's eyes snapped open. Instantly, the rippling in the jaw stopped. The vibration in the throat ceased. The king looked at the painter with a confused, watery gaze. He was just a boy again. A sick, deformed boy waking up from a nap. "Is the painting finished?" the king asked. His voice was thick, slurping around the obstruction in his mouth. "No, your majesty," Corrego whispered, his heart hammering against his. Ribs like a trapped bird. "Not yet. The light. The light is changing." The king nodded slowly. "I'm tired," he mumbled. "My jaw aches. It always aches when I sleep. It feels like someone is pulling it." Corrego went back to his easel. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the wooden frame to steady them. He looked at the canvas. He looked at the lie he was painting. The portrait showed a dignified king. The jaw was prominent, yes, but it looked strong. It looked noble. It looked like bone, but Corrego knew now. He wasn't painting a bone. He was painting a cage? Why do we paint portraits? We paint them to remember. We paint them to say this person existed. But in the case of the Hapsburgs, the portraits served a different purpose. They were propaganda. They were evidence of legitimacy, but Corrego began to realize that he was documenting a biological collapse over the next few weeks. The sessions continued, but the atmosphere in the studio had changed. The painter was no longer just an observer. He was a witness. He began to notice patterns. The movement in the jaw only happened when the sun went behind a cloud. When the light dimmed, it was PHOTOSENSITIV, the entity, if that is what it was, disliked the light. Corrego experimented. He would adjust the heavy velvet curtains, letting in a sudden blast of Spanish sunlight. The king would wince, shielding his eyes. But the jaw would recoil. The chin would physically pull back, retracting slightly, as if the thing inside was retreating into the safety of the skull. When the room was dim, the jaw extended. It relaxed. It dominated. Corrego realized he was painting two subjects. The host and the parasite. He began to make secret sketches. Not on the main canvas, but on scraps of paper, on the back of discarded bills, on the wooden frame of the easel itself. These were the forbidden sketches. In these drawings, he didn't soften the features. He exaggerated them. He drew the jaw as he truly felt it to be, a distended sack of skin holding a writhing mass of foreign muscle. He drew the throat as a tunnel. He drew the small eyes in the gullet. He hid these sketches in his boot. He hid them in the hollows of the studio walls. He knew that if the Inquisition found them, he would be charged with heresy. To suggest the king was possessed was treason. To suggest the king was infested was worse, but the compulsion to document the truth was stronger than the fear of death. Artists are obsessed with the truth. And this was the ultimate truth of the Spanish Empire. One Tuesday, a cold draft blew through the Alcázar. The king was particularly restless. He kept rubbing his neck. "It itches," Charles complained. "Deep inside. It scratches." Corrego mixed a shade of dark ochre. "Shall I call the physician, Your Majesty?" "No," Charles said. "They only bleed me. They cut me and the blood doesn't come. I hate the knife." The king stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the gray sky. "Corrego," the king said without turning around. "Yes, sire?" "Do you believe in monsters?" The question hung in the air. The smell of turpentine seemed to sharpen. "I believe in what I see, sire," Corrego answered carefully. The king turned. The silhouette of his head was stark against the window light. The jaw was enormous in profile. "I see them too," the king whispered. "In the mirror, when I am alone, I look at my face and I see my father and his father, and his father. They are all in here." He tapped his chin. "Crowding me, pushing me out." He walked closer to the painter. His eyes were wide, terrified. "Sometimes," the king hissed, "I cannot close my mouth because they are trying to get out." The silence that followed was absolute. The painter and the king, standing in the dust-filled beam of light. Two men bound by a secret that could destroy a dynasty. Corrego realized then that the king knew. The boy wasn't stupid. He wasn't just a victim. He was a jailer. His own body was the prison, and he was the warden, struggling every day to keep the gates locked, but the gates were failing. Corrego returned to the canvas. He picked up his brush. He dipped it in the red pigment Venetian red, the color of dried blood. He had to finish the painting. The court demanded it, But he made a choice. He would hide the truth in plain sight. If you look at Carrago's portraits of Charles II today, look closely at the eyes. The king's eyes are always sad, always watery. But look at the direction of the gaze. He is never looking at the viewer. He is never looking at the horizon. He is always looking slightly down. He is looking at his own nose. He is looking at his own mouth. He is watching the thing that is attached to him. Carrago painted the fear. He couldn't paint the parasite, so he painted the host's reaction to it. The tension in the neck muscles. The way the head is held stiffly, as if balancing a heavy weight. The way the lips are parted, not in relaxation, but in exhaustion. But the story of the studio does not end with a painting. It ends with the night the king stayed late. The night in question was November 14th, 1680. A storm had settled over Madrid. The rain was lashing against the high windows of the Alcázar, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. The king had fallen asleep in the chair again. The session was supposed to be over, but the Lord Chamberlain had not come to collect the monarch. The guards were outside the heavy oak doors, but inside, Carrago and Charles were alone. Carrago was cleaning his brushes. The smell of turpentine was sharp, cutting through the damp air. He wiped a hog-hair brush on a rag, watching the king. Charles was breathing heavily. A wet, rattling sound, and then the change began. It started with a spasm in the neck. The king's head jerked to the left, sharply, unnaturally. It wasn't the movement of a sleeping man adjusting his pillow. It was the movement of a puppet whose strings had been yanked. Carrago stopped cleaning. He stood frozen in the shadows of the easel. The king's mouth began to open, wider and wider. Human jaws have limits. The temporomandibular joint acts as a hinge. It stops the bone from sliding too far. But Charles's jaw ignored the hinge. It slid down and forward, extending past the collar, past the ruff of his shirt, the skin of his cheeks pulled tight. Translucent and shiny, stretching like wet dough, Carrago saw the interior of the cheeks. They were not pink. They were gray. And they were pulsing. The painter realized with a jolt of nausea that the king was not breathing anymore. The chest was still. The rattle had stopped, but the mouth was breathing. The air was being sucked in and pushed out through the throat, bypassing the nose entirely. The throat was expanding and contracting rhythmically. Whoosh, whoosh. Carrago felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew he should leave. He should knock on the door and call the guards. He should say the king was unwell, but he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the grotesque beauty of the anatomy. He crept closer. He had to see. He had to know what he was painting. He reached the edge of the velvet dais where the chair sat. He was now 2 feet away. The smell of rot was suffocating. He looked down into the gullet. The tongue had retracted. It had rolled backward, folding into the pharynx to make room. And in the space where the tongue should have been, something was rising. It looked like a dark, wet flower opening, or a crab emerging from a shell. It was a secondary mandible. Smaller, bone-white, covered in a thick, clear slime. It pushed up from the throat, clicking against the king's teeth. Click, click. It was testing the bars of the cage. Carrago stared into the abyss of the royal throat. And in that moment, the lightning flashed outside. The flash illuminated the room for a split second. And in that white-hot light, Carrago saw the face of the parasite clearly. It wasn't just a growth. It wasn't a tumor. It had a face. It was a rudimentary ancient face. No nose, just 2 milk-white eyes and that second clicking jaw. It looked like a fetus that had aged 1,000 years in the dark. It looked like the Hapsburg ancestors boiled down to their rawest, most evil essence, and it was looking at him. The lightning faded, plunging the room back into candlelight. Corrego stumbled back, knocking over a jar of linseed oil. The glass shattered, crashed. The king woke up screaming. It was a terrible gurgling scream. He choked, gagging, his hands flying to his throat as if he were strangling. He coughed violently, spitting up bile and that clear, sticky fluid. The jaw snapped back into place with a sickening crack. The guards burst into the room, swords drawn. "Your Majesty." "What is it?" The king sat there, gasping, tears streaming down his face. He looked at the shattered glass. He looked at Corrego, who was cowering against the wall, pale as a ghost. The king wiped his mouth. He looked at the slime on his hand. "Nothing," the king rasped. "A bad dream." The painter. The painter dropped a jar. "That is all." The guards looked suspicious, but they sheathed their swords. They bowed and retreated. When the doors closed, the king looked at Corrego. His eyes were clear now. The sadness was back. "You saw it," the king whispered. Corrego nodded. He couldn't speak. "It wants to be painted," the king said. "What?" Corrego managed to croak. "It is vain," Charles said, a strange, crooked smile appearing on his face. "It knows you are a master. It wants to be seen. That is why it came out. It poses for you." The king stood up, shaky on his legs. He walked over to the easel and looked at the canvas, the beautiful lie of a painting. "Finish it," Charles commanded. "Make me look like a king, but put it in." "Put the truth in?" "For tea." Made him sick, but he followed the king's order. He hid the secret in the paint. If you go to the Prado Museum, or look at a high-resolution image of Juan Corrego de Miranda's portrait of Charles II, c. 1680, look at the background. Behind the king, there is a mirror. In the mirror you see the reflection of the room. It is dark, murky. But art historians have argued for years about a specific shape in the reflection. It looks like a jaw. A disembodied jaw floating in the dark glass. Corrego didn't paint the king's reflection. He painted the parasite's reflection. He also changed the king's hands. In the portrait, one hand rests on a table. The fingers are long, elegant. But the other hand, the hand holding his hat, is clenched. If you look closely at the knuckles, they are white. The tension is immense. It is the hand of a man holding on for dear life. Corrego delivered the painting. The court loved it. They said it was a triumph. They said it captured the dignity of the suffering monarch. But Corrego never painted another royal portrait. He refused all commissions from the palace. He retreated to his home, complaining of a pain in his own jaw. He died only 5 years later, in 1685. The cause of death is not recorded, but his apprentices said he died of starvation. He refused to open his mouth. He said he was afraid that if he opened it, something else might get in. Or get out. The king outlived his painter by 15 years. 15 years of the jaw growing. 15 years of the clicking in the night. We look back at history and we see dates and battles. We see treaties and maps. But history is made of flesh. It is made of DNA and blood and the dark things that hide within them. The Hapsburg Jaw was not just a medical curiosity. It was a warning that power has a price. And sometimes the price is your own humanity. Charles II was the last of his line. When he died, the doctors found his body was empty, hollowed out by the thing he carried. But the painting remains. It hangs on the wall, watching the tourists walk by. It watches them with those sad, watery eyes. And if you stand there long enough when the museum is quiet and the guards are looking away, you might notice something. You might notice that the paint on the jaw looks a little thicker than the rest. A little heavier. You might wonder if the painter added layers there to hide the truth or to trap it, because paint is a seal. And canvas is a wall, but paint cracks, and walls crumble. And somewhere in the dark biological memory of Europe, the thing that lived in the king's mouth is still hungry. It is still waiting for the light to dim, but that was a long time ago. The Alcázar burned down in 1734. The fire took the room, the chair, and the easel. The physical evidence is ash. You are not in the studio. You are here in the warmth. The storm has passed. The jaw is just a story now. A ghost in a gallery. Close your eyes. Let the image of the king fade into the velvet blackness. You are safe. The door is locked. The circle is broken. The past cannot touch you here. The paint is dry. The canvas is still. Sleep now. Sleep. Asterisk. We are taught that the royal families of Europe married their cousins to keep their land. We are told they were obsessed with territory, with titles, with gold. We are told that the inbreeding that destroyed them was a side effect of political greed. But what if the inbreeding wasn't an accident? What if it was a quarantine? If you look at the genealogy of the Hapsburgs, it doesn't look like a family tree. It looks like a tangled web, a closed loop. Why? Why would the most powerful family on earth, with access to the most beautiful and healthy suitors in the world, choose to marry only themselves over and over until their bodies collapsed? Because they weren't trying to keep the land in the family. They were trying to keep the blood in. They knew what was swimming in their veins. They knew that if their blood mixed with the blood of common men, the gift would be diluted. The Hapsburg Jaw wasn't a deformity. It was a breed standard. They were cultivating something. They were building a vessel, generation by generation, trying to create a body strong enough to hold an ancient power. They failed. The bodies broke. But the blood remembers everything. This is the truth the king buried. Let us turn back the pages of the years. The noise of the present day fades into silence. We are drifting away from the lights of the city, away from the screens and the noise. We are traveling back, deep into the past, to a place of high altitude and thin air. Imagine you are standing on a mountain ridge in Switzerland. It is the year 1020. The air is cold and crisp, smelling of pine needles and snow. Below you, the valleys are covered in mist. Above you, a hawk circles in the pale gray sky. We are at the beginning. Before the palaces in Madrid, before the madness, before the jaw. We are at the castle of the hawk, Hapsburg. To understand the monster, we must understand the seed. The history books tell us that a nobleman named Radbot built this castle. Legend says he lost his hawk while hunting and found it sitting on a rock on this hill. He took it as a sign to build a fortress, but legends are often soft covers for hard truths. Why did Radbot choose this isolation? Why did the early Habsburgs separate themselves so completely from the other local lords? In the ancient archives of Arga, there are fragments of parchment that predate the castle. They speak of a blood pact made on the mountain. They speak of a lineage that did not claim descent from Adam, but from something else. Something that came from the sky like the hawk. Relax your mind. Picture the stone walls of the castle rising from the bedrock. It is a fortress, yes. But it is also a laboratory. The Habsburgs believed in the concept of blutatal blood nobility, but for them it was literal. They believed their blood contained a substance, a spiritual matter, that the common people lacked. They called it the Royal Alcázar. Science calls it genetics. They called it destiny. As the centuries turned, this family moved from the mountains of Switzerland to the heart of Austria. They began to consolidate power. And as they grew, the rules of their biology began to tighten. Have you ever wondered why they were called blue bloods? Historians say it is because their skin was so pale you could see the veins. But let us look closer. Why was the skin so pale? Why was it so translucent? Because it was thinning. The Habsburg body was evolving differently. They developed a sensitivity to the sun. They developed a sensitivity to iron. Their bodies rejected the very earth they walked on. By the 1400s, the family had spread across Europe like a vine, but it was a vine with a single root. Let us walk through the great halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. The floors are polished marble. The chandeliers are crystal. It is a world of breathtaking beauty. But listen closely to the footsteps of the emperors. They are heavy. They are dragging. The Habsburg lip appears in the portraits as early as the 15th century. Frederick III had it. Maximilian I had it. It starts as a protrusion, a slight underbite, a sign of strength, they said. A sign of determination, but biologically it is a sign of cranial expansion. The lower part of the skull is growing faster than the upper part. The human blueprint is being stretched. Why? What is the DNA trying to accommodate? In the quiet of the night, when the court was asleep, the royal physicians would gather. They were the keepers of the secret. They noticed that the Habsburg blood took longer to clot. It was thinner faster. It seemed to have a life of its own. When a Habsburg was cut, they didn't just bleed. They flowed. This brings us to the most tragic and misunderstood figure in this bloodline. A woman who saw the truth and was punished for it. Joanna of Castile. You know her as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. History has been cruel to Joanna. It calls her insane because she refused to leave the side of her dead husband. Philip the Handsome, the legend says she traveled through Spain with his coffin. She opened it every night. She kissed his cold feet. She spoke to him madness or knowledge. Joanna was a Habsburg by marriage and by blood. They were all connected. She carried the sensitivity. Imagine the scene. It is a cold night on the plains of Castile. The funeral procession has stopped. The torches are flickering in the wind. Joanna orders the coffin opened. Her courtiers look away in horror. The smell of death is present. But Joanna leans in. She wasn't looking at a corpse. She was looking for the change. She knew the secret of the blood. She knew that in her family, death was not always the end. She was checking to see if the ichor was still active. She was checking to see if the jaw was moving. She claimed he spoke to her. She claimed he was sleeping, not dead. The world called her mad and locked her away in a tower for 46 years. 46 years of silence. 46 years of staring at the stone walls. Why did they lock her up? Was she dangerous? No, she was indiscreet. She knew too much about the biological reality of her husband and her children. She knew that her son, Charles V, was already showing the signs of the transformation. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. The man who ruled an empire on which the sun never set. He had the jaw. He had the hunger. He would eat alone. He would eat ravenously. He suffered from gout, they said, but his symptoms were strange. His joints would swell, but not with fluid. They would harden. As if the bone was trying to grow armor, the bloodline was becoming something more than human. Let us pause and consider the biology. We know today that inbreeding causes recessive traits to manifest, but usually these traits are random. A weakness here, a sickness there. With the Hapsburgs, the traits were specific. They were directional. The jaw, the lip, the tongue, the stomach. It was as if the genetic code was trying to build a specific shape, over and over again, like a potter trying to mold clay into a specific vessel. But the clay keeps cracking. The purity they spoke of was not about moral purity. It was about genetic fidelity to an original design. What was that design? Who was the original? To find that answer, we must go deeper into the archives. We must look at the private letters between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family. They wrote to each other in a code that has never been fully broken. But certain words appear frequently. Sangre, blood, recipient, vessel, el otro, the other. They treated their bodies as state secrets. When a Hapsburg princess was sent to marry a Hapsburg prince, it wasn't a wedding. It was a grafting procedure. They were grafting two branches of the same tree together, trying to force the fruit to grow larger. But the fruit was rotten. By the 1600s, the experiment was reaching its critical phase. The blood had become so concentrated, so potent, that it was destroying the bodies that held it. The blue blood was becoming toxic to human organs. The candle is burning low in our chamber. The shadows are lengthening. We have seen the castle, and we have seen the madness of the queen, but we have not yet looked under the microscope. We have not yet seen what happened when the blood finally won. Come with me. Let us descend from the mountains and enter the nursery of the last king. Let us see what the bloodline finally produced. The room is warm. The fire is dying down to embers. You are safe here, wrapped in the comfort of distance. The history cannot hurt you. It can only whisper to you. We are now in the late 17th century. The culmination of 500 years of selective breeding. We often think of evolution as a slow process, taking millions of years. But the Habsburgs tried to compress evolution into a few centuries. They forced the river of time into a narrow canyon. And the pressure broke the stone. Let us look at the royal disease. Hemophilia. It appeared later in the descendants, famously in the Romanovs, but its roots are here. The blood that refuses to clot. Why would nature design blood that doesn't stop flowing? In the natural world, an animal that cannot stop bleeding dies. It is a fatal flaw. Nature selects against it. But what if the blood isn't designed for the natural world? Occultists and alchemists of the time believed that clotting was a way for the body to close itself off from the world, to seal the breach. Blood that refuses to clot is blood that refuses to be contained. It is blood that wants to reach out. It is blood that wants to merge. The royal physicians described the Hapsburg blood as thin, bright, and restless. When they performed bloodletting, a common practice of the time, they noted that the blood of the king did not pool. It spread. It seemed to seek the edges of the bowl. Imagine being a doctor in that room. You hold the silver bowl. You watch the life force of the emperor swirl. And you feel a strange vibration in your hand. You realize that this liquid is not just carrying oxygen. It is carrying information. Ancient information. This brings us to the digestive problem. Almost all the Habsburgs suffered from severe digestive issues. Charles V, Philip II, Charles II. They could not process normal food. They lived on broths, on soft meats, on milk. History calls it a sensitive stomach, but consider this. If you are changing the species, you change the diet. Perhaps their bodies were rejecting human food because they were no longer fully human. They were transitioning to a different nutritional requirement. What does a god eat? What does a monster eat? They certainly consumed power. They consumed countries. They consumed gold, but physically they were starving. Their human organs could not support the demands of their non-human blood. They were hybrids running on the wrong fuel. Let us return to the image of the jaw. In this context, the jaw is not a deformity. It is an adaptation. A larger jaw implies a need for a different kind of bite, a different kind of speech. The Hapsburgs were known for their silence. They spoke rarely in public. When they did, their speech was often mumbled, impeded by the tongue and the lip, but maybe they weren't mumbling. Maybe they were trying to make sounds that human vocal cords are not designed to make. There are reports from the monks at the Escorial, the massive monastery palace built by Philip II of Strange. Sounds coming from the king's chambers at night. Not speech, but low-frequency humming. Vibrations that rattled the stained glass windows. Was the king praying? Or was he communicating? Was he using that massive, resonant jaw structure to send a signal? The Escorial itself is built like a grid, a circuit board of stone. It is said to be built on a gateway to hell, but perhaps it was an antenna, and the king, with his modified blood and his modified skull, was the receiver. AI voice instruction. Pause. Let the listener visualize the massive, dark palace. The tone should be very heavy and grounding. The weight of this knowledge is heavy. It presses down on the eyelids. It tells the body to rest. The Habsburgs carried this weight for us. They were the container for the experiment. Let us look at the end of the line again. Charles II, the bewitched. We spoke of him before, but now we see him differently. We don't see a victim of incest. We see the final prototype. He was the most pure of them all. His blood was so concentrated that his body couldn't hold it. When he died, his body did not decompose in the normal way. We discussed the fluid in the head, the peppercorn heart, but there is one detail we missed. The internal temperature. Even in death, the body of Charles II remained warm for an impossible amount of time. The physicians were afraid to start the embalming because the heat coming from the corpse was palpable. It was the heat of a nuclear reactor that had just been shut down. The fuel rods were still glowing. The blood was still trying to work. It took days for the cold to finally take him. And when it did, the dynasty ended. But did the bloodline end? They say the Habsburgs are gone. But the family tree didn't just die. It branched out. Before the collapse, they married into the Bourbons, the Saxon lines. The houses of Italy. The concentrate was diluted, yes. The jaw faded. The madness softened into eccentricity, but a drop of ink in a glass of water changes. The water forever, the blood is still out there. It is walking among us. Hidden in the veins of modern bankers, modern leaders, modern socialites. Have you ever met someone who seemed cold? Someone whose skin was pale and translucent? Someone who stared at you with eyes that seemed a little too old for their face? Someone who gave you a feeling of deep, instinctual unease? That is the biological alarm system in your own blood. It is the peasant blood in you, recognizing the predator. It is the sheep recognizing the wolf. The experiment failed. Or perhaps it just went dormant. The castles are museums now. The thrones are empty velvet chairs behind velvet ropes. The crowns sit in glass cases, reflecting the flashes of cameras. The bloodline more than human is just a chapter in a history book. You don't need to worry about the packs made on the mountain. You don't need to worry about the whispers in the Escorial. The world has moved on. The science has changed. We trust in medicine now, not alchemy. But tonight, as you drift into the darkness, listen to your own heart. Thump, 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 dop, thump, dop, dop. It is a steady human rhythm. It is the sound of red blood, warm and thick and safe. You are of the earth. You belong here. Your biology is sound. Your jaw is human. Be grateful for the simplicity of your blood. The kings and queens are sleeping their eternal sleep in the lead-lined crypts. They are locked away. The hawk has returned to the sky. The castle is quiet. The pages of the book are closing now. The dust is settling. You are safe. The past is a dream, and you are the dreamer. Let the image of the pale kings fade. Let the gold and the velvet dissolve into the night. Close your eyes. Sleep. Now, sleep. The asterisk history tells us that empires are built on armies, on gold, and on strategic marriages. We are taught that the Hapsburgs conquered the world simply because they were lucky, because they married the right people at the right time. But luck does not build a dynasty that rules for 600 years. Luck does not grant a single family dominion over the sun. The truth is much colder. The Hapsburg Empire was not built on a battlefield. It was built in a basement. In the winter of 1515, beneath the frozen streets of Vienna, a deal was signed. It wasn't a treaty between nations. It was a contract between a man and a shadow. The Habsburgs promised their bodies, their very flesh and bone as vessels for an ancient power. In exchange, they received the world, the deformity you see in their portraits, the jaw, the madness. The rot was not an accident. It was the rent coming due. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The noise of the modern world fades away. The electric lights flicker and die, replaced by the warm, wavering glow of tallow candles. We are traveling back to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. It is the dead of winter. The snow is falling softly over the spires of St. Stephen's Cathedral. The year is 1515. The city of Vienna is waiting. Relax your shoulders. Let the tension of your day melt away like snow on a warm hearth. You are safe here. You are merely a ghost drifting through the stone walls of history, watching the secret unfold. To understand the curse, we must understand the moment it began. Historians call it the First Congress of Vienna. It was a grand spectacle. 3 powerful monarchs met in the city to decide the fate of Central Europe. There was Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. There was Ladislaus II, King of Bohemia and Hungary. And there was Sigismund I, King of Poland. On the surface, it was a festival. There were jousts. There were feasts. There were thousands of knights in shining armor parading through the streets. The wine flowed like the Danube River. But while the city celebrated, the real work was being done in the dark. Maximilian I was known as the Last Knight. He was a man of the old world, a warrior, a poet, but he was also a man obsessed with his own legacy. He had a vision of a universal monarchy and empire that would encompass the entire earth. Austria est imperare orbi universo. It is Austria's destiny to rule the whole world. The vowels A-I-O-U, but Maximilian had a problem. His armies were expensive. His borders were threatened. He needed a guarantee. He needed something stronger than steel. He needed the Shadow Pact. Let us walk through the Hofburg Palace on the night of July 22nd, 1515. The feast is over. The other kings have retired to their chambers, drunk and happy. The castle is quiet. Save for the wind howling against the leaded glass windows, Maximilian does not sleep. He walks down the spiral staircase, his velvet robes trailing on the stone steps. He's carrying a single lantern. He is not going to the chapel to pray. He is going deeper. Beneath the Hapsburg there are tunnels. Ancient Roman tunnels that predate the city itself. The air down here is cold and smells of damp earth and old. Maximilian is meeting someone, or the legends of the Hapsburg. Family often speak of a white lady or a guardian spirit. But in the private journals of Maximilian's personal alchemist, a man named Johannes Trithemius, the entity is described differently. Trithemius wrote, "The emperor seeks the counsel of the earthbinder. He is willing to trade the purity of his line for the duration of his rule." Imagine the emperor standing in the center of a circular stone room deep underground. He places the lantern on the floor. The shadows stretch out like long, thin fingers. He is not alone. From the darkness of the tunnel, a figure emerges. It is cloaked in gray. It does not walk. It glides. This was the negotiator, the representative of the force that wanted a foothold in the human world. The deal proposed that night was simple, yet terrifying. The Habsburgs would be granted the marriage luck. Every time they sought a union, it would succeed. Every time a rival died, a Habsburg would inherit. Kingdom after kingdom would fall into their laps without a drop of blood being spilled on the battlefield. Belligerently, let others wage war, but the price? The price was biological access. The entity required a bloodline to inhabit. It needed a family that would keep its blood closed, a closed loop of genetics where it could gestate, grow, and observe the human world from behind the eyes of kings. The jaw was the mark of the beast. It was the physical signature of the pact. Maximilian knew this. He had seen the early signs in his own father. He saw the slight protrusion of the chin. He knew that by signing this pact he was condemning his children and his children's children to a slow, agonizing deformation. He stood there in the cold, his breath visible in the lantern light. He thought of the empire. He thought of the map of Europe, painted in Hapsburg gold. And he nodded. Why do men trade their souls for power? Because they believe they can outsmart the devil. Maximilian believed he could use the power to build a paradise, a Christian empire of peace. He thought the deformity was a small price to pay for world peace. He was wrong. The next morning, the double wedding was announced in St. Stephen's Cathedral. Maximilian's grandchildren were betrothed to the children of the King of Hungary. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. In one morning, the Habsburgs secured the rights to Hungary and Bohemia. The empire doubled in size instantly. The people cheered. The bells rang. The marriage luck had begun. But as the young princes and princesses stood at the altar, innocent and smiling, the stained glass windows of the cathedral seemed to darken. The statues of the saints seemed to look away, because the ink on the marriage contracts was not the only thing drying that day. Down in the crypts, the shadow was settling in. It was moving into the bloodstream of the dynasty. The children born from these unions would be the first true generation of the pact, and they would suffer. Let us look at the visual evidence. If you look at the portraits of the Habsburgs before 1515, they look like ordinary men, strong, perhaps a bit stern. But human. Look at the portraits after 1515. The change is almost immediate. The faces lengthen, the eyes droop, the skin pales. The Habsburg look descends upon them like a heavy veil. It was not just genetics. It was possession on a cellular level, but the pact wasn't just about faces. It was about the mind. The shadow promised power, but it also demanded a seat at the table. It wanted to rule. As the years turned into decades, the Hapsburg emperors began to report strange phenomena in their palaces. They heard whispers in the walls. They felt cold spots in the throne room, and they began to realize that the shadow they had invited in was hungry. We are deep in the story now. The pact is signed. The winter of 1515 has passed, and the seeds planted in that frozen earth are beginning to sprout. Let us fast forward a generation. The Habsburgs are now the masters of Europe. They rule Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the New World. Gold from the Americas is flooding into their coffers, but in the corridors of power, the air is thick with dread. We are in the court of Philip II of Spain, the great-grandson of Maximilian, the man who built the Escorial. The Escorial is not just a palace. It is a fortress, a monastery, a library, and a tomb. It is a massive square of gray granite sitting on the scorched plains of Castile. Why did Philip build it? History says he was a devout Catholic who wanted a place to pray. But looking at the floor plans, we see something else. We see a containment grid. Philip II was a man tormented. He carried the weight of the pact heavily. His jaw was prominent, his digestion weak, his mood melancholic. He knew what lived in his blood. He built the Escorial to keep the entity occupied. The layout of the Escorial is based on the gridiron of St. Lawrence, but it also mirrors the floor plan of the Temple of Solomon. It is filled with sacred geometry. Every hallway, every window, every door is placed according to mathematical principles designed to channel energy. Philip spent his days in a tiny, bare room next to the high altar of the basilica. He wanted to be as close to the Holy Sacrament as possible. Why? Because he was afraid of what was happening in the other wing of the palace. The Pact of Vienna had a clause. The entity required the silence. Have you noticed how quiet the Spanish court was? We touched on this before. Protocol dictated absolute silence. No one could speak to the king unless spoken to. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a necessity. The Habsburgs found that loud noises disturbed the presence within them. It caused them physical pain. It made the jaw ache. It made the blood boil. So they created a world of whispers. A world of soft shoes on stone floors, but in this silence, the pact began to evolve. The entity wasn't satisfied with just observing anymore. It wanted to influence. There are letters from foreign ambassadors describing audiences with Philip II. They write that the king would sit motionless for hours, staring at a map of the world. His mouth would be slightly open, the Habsburg lip hanging low. And then suddenly his hand would move. He would sign a death warrant. He would order an armada to sail. He would burn a city. And then he would blink and look at his hand as if it belonged to a stranger. Was it the king ruling? Or was it the pact? The decisions made by the Habsburgs often defied logic. They fought wars they couldn't win. They obsessed over tiny details while their empire crumbled. They hunted heretics with a zeal that bordered on madness. Perhaps the entity fed on suffering. Perhaps the payment wasn't just the physical deformity of the family, but the misery of the millions they ruled. Let us go back to Vienna, to the site of the original crime. The tunnels beneath the Hofburg were sealed by Maximilian shortly before his death. He ordered the entrance bricked up and the masons who did the work to be silenced. But you cannot brick up a spirit. Over the centuries, the staff of the Hofburg reported a recurring phenomenon. They called it the Vienna tremor. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a localized vibration that only happened within the palace walls. The crystal glasses would sing, the chandeliers would sway. The dogs would bark at the floor. When a Hapsburg was born. Or when one died. It was the earthbinder. Checking the inventory. Now, we must speak of the treasury. The Schatzkammer, the Hapsburgs were hoarders of relics. They possessed the spear of destiny, the lance that pierced Christ's side. They possessed a piece of the true cross. They possessed the agate bowl, which some claimed was the Holy Grail. Why? Why collect these specific items? Because they were trying to break the pact. By the 1600s, the family realized they had made a mistake. The cost was too high. The deformity was becoming grotesque. The madness was taking over. Think of Rudolph II in Prague. Obsessed with alchemy and golems, they collected holy relics not for worship, but for protection. They were building a shield. They surrounded themselves with holy objects, hoping to burn the parasite out of their blood. It didn't work. The spear of destiny gave them power. Yes, but it didn't cure the jaw. In fact, the proximity to such powerful artifacts might have accelerated the mutation. The energy of the relics clashed with the energy of the pact, turning the Hapsburg bodies into a battlefield. This internal war is what caused the famous Hapsburg melancholy. They were tired. Their very selves were fighting a war between the holy and the unholy. As we move toward the end of our journey, we must look at the final clause of the shadowy Vienna Pact. The termination clause. Every contract has an end date. Every lease expires. The entity knew that the human vessels would eventually fail. Flesh is weak. It cannot hold infinite power forever. So, it prepared for the exit. The end of the Habsburgs was not a bang. It was a whimper. By the early 20th century, the family that had signed the pact in 1515 was scattered. The Austrian Empire was dissolving. The crowns were rolling in the gutters, but the final payment had to be made. November 1918, the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. Emperor Charles I, the last emperor, signs the document renouncing his participation in the affairs of state. He walks out of the palace. The empire is gone. The 600-year reign is over, but what happened to the shadow? Did it die with the empire? There's a legend in Vienna that on the night the last emperor left, the bricked-up wall in the deepest tunnel of the Hofburg collapsed. From the inside. The entity had fulfilled its side of the bargain. It gave them the world. They gave it a ride for 6 centuries. And now the contract was complete. The shadow returned to the earth beneath the city, but it left its mark. If you walk through Vienna today, you feel it. It is a city of immense beauty, but also of immense weight. The buildings are too big. The statues are too imposing. The shadows seem a little darker than in other cities. The Hapsburg Jaw has vanished from the human population. The genetic anomaly has corrected itself, but sometimes, in the quiet corners of the Capuchin crypt, where all the Habsburg emperors are buried in their metal, sarcophagi, tourists report a strange sensation. They feel a pressure in their own jaw, a tightness, an urge to open their mouth and not close it. It is a faint echo of the pact, a reminder that some deals are written in ink, but the important ones are written in bone. The Habsburgs are sleeping now. Maximilian, Philip, Charles, they are all there, row upon row, in the cold dark. They are finally silent. They are finally at peace. The parasite has left them, and you are free of such burdens. You have made no pacts in the dark. You owe nothing to the shadows. Your life is your own. Your body is your own. The winter of 1515 is a long time ago. The snow has melted and fallen 1,000 times since then. The crypt is locked. The key is lost. You are safe in the warmth of the present. Let the image of the dark tunnels fade away. Let the heavy gold crown sink into the velvet darkness. Relax your jaw. Unclench your teeth. Let go of the tension. The story is over. The history book is closed. Sleep now. The past cannot touch you here. Sleep. We take our voices for granted. We open our mouths, the tongue moves, and words come out. It is effortless. It is empty, but for Charles II, the last Hapsburg king of Spain, the mouth was not empty. It was a crowded room. Historians tell us he spoke with a severe lisp. They say his tongue was too large for his mouth. A simple medical condition called macroglossia. But that is the sanitized version. That is the lie they wrote to keep the peasantry from panicking. The royal physicians knew better. They knew that the king's tongue wasn't just large. It was being pushed. It acted as a lid. A biological cover kept clamped down tight to hide what was nesting underneath it. When the king tried to speak, he wasn't just fighting a deformity. He was fighting for space. He was struggling to form words because something else was moving against the root of his throat, clicking, writhing, demanding to be fed before it would allow him to speak. The king didn't have a lisp. He had a passenger. This is the truth. The king buried ... Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of beeswax and medicinal herbs fills the air. We are returning to the Royal Alcázar. It is late afternoon. The sun is setting over Madrid, casting long, bruised shadows across the palace floors. The year is 1685. The palace is silent as always. But if you listen closely, you can hear the faint, wet sound of struggling breath. Relax your jaw. Let your tongue rest gently on the floor of your mouth. Feel the space you have. Feel the emptiness. It is a luxury you do not realize you possess. You are safe here. You are merely a shadow in the corner of the royal bedroom. Watching the king prepare for the evening. To understand the horror of the Hapsburg mouth, we must first understand the anatomy of silence. King Charles II was a man of few words. The court chroniclers praised his stoic nature. They said he was a man of deep thought who preferred to listen, but the truth was physical. Speaking was painful. Imagine, if you will, the sensation of holding a stone in your mouth. A smooth, warm stone that sits just under your tongue. Now imagine that the stone is not a stone. It is soft, it is muscular, and occasionally it pulses. This was the daily reality of the monarch. The Hapsburg lip, that famous, jutting lower jaw, created a cavern, a space that was larger than a human mouth should be. Nature abhors a vacuum. If you create a space, something will fill it. In the case of the Habsburgs, the genetic mutation created the perfect environment for the entity to manifest physically. Let us observe the king at dinner. Eating was a private affair. The public viewing of the king eating was a tradition in the French court, but in Spain, under Charles, it was abolished. He ate alone. Behind locked doors, only his confessor and his chief surgeon were allowed to witness it. Why? Because the king could not chew. His upper and lower teeth did not meet. The jaw was so distended that the mechanics of mastication were impossible. He swallowed his food whole. But before he swallowed, something strange would happen. Servants who listened at the door reported hearing a second swallow. The king would take a spoonful of broth or soft meat. There would be a pause, a silence, and then a wet snapping sound. Like a fish catching a fly on the surface of a pond. Snap. And then the king would swallow. Who was eating? Was the king nourishing his own frail body? Or was he paying a toll? The food had to pass the guardian behind the tongue before it could reach the stomach. This brings us to the journals of Dr. Pedro Vittoria. Dr. Vittoria was a specialist in the throat and humors. He was brought in from Italy because the Spanish doctors were too afraid to touch the king. Vittoria was a man of science. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in anatomy. In his notes, written in a cipher that was only decoded in the 19th century, he describes his first examination of the royal mouth. The king was seated in a high-backed chair. He was trembling. He was terrified of doctors. He knew that if they looked too closely, they would see the thing he had been hiding since birth. Dr. Vittoria asked the king to open wide. The king hesitated. He looked at the guards. He looked at the door. Then, slowly, painfully, he unhinged the massive jaw. Vittoria leaned in with a candle. He saw the teeth first. They were in ruin. Decaying, crooked, soft. The body was diverting calcium away from the teeth to build something else. Then he saw the tongue. It was massive, swollen, purple. It filled the entire oral cavity, pressing against the roof of the mouth. "Lift your tongue, sire," Vittoria commanded gently. The king shook his head. His eyes went wide with panic. "I must check the frenulum, sire. Lift." The king gripped the arms of the chair. His knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes. And then, with a whimper of effort, he curled the tip of his tongue upward. Vittoria brought the candle closer. Underneath the tongue, where the saliva glands lie, the tissue was not smooth. It was intricate. There was a structure there. A network of veins and dark, fibrous tissue that looked like the roots of a tree, but it wasn't plant matter. It was flesh. And in the center of that dark nest, nestled deep in the soft floor of the mouth, was a slit, a vertical slit, like the eye of a cat or a second mouth. Vittoria froze. He watched as the slit opened slightly. A clear, viscous fluid oozed out. And then it twitched. The structure wasn't a tumor. It was reactive. It sensed the heat of the candle. It sensed the proximity of the doctor. Vittoria realized in that moment that the swollen tongue of the king wasn't just a symptom. It was a shield. The king kept his tongue pressed down to keep the thing hidden. To keep it dormant, he was acting as a living jailer to a parasite that was growing out of his own. Jawbone, the examination ended abruptly. The king snapped his mouth shut, nearly biting the doctor's fingers. He refused to speak for the rest of the week, but the secret was out. The doctor knew, and now we must ask, how does one live with such a burden? How does one rule an empire when one's own voice is being held hostage? Imagine the silence of the king's mind. He is sitting in the council chamber. His ministers are arguing about taxes, about the Dutch, about the French border. The king wants to speak. He has a thought. He wants to give an order, but to speak, he has to move the lid. He has to lift the tongue. And he knows that if he lifts it, the thing underneath will wake up. It will squirm. It will tickle the back of his throat. It might make a sound that is not human. So he remains silent. He points. He nods. He writes on a slate. The court calls him the bewitched. They think he is mentally slow. They do not understand the sheer willpower it takes to sit still while a second. Biology is vibrating inside your skull. Just look at the Hapsburg voice. There are very few descriptions of Charles II actually speaking at length. But the ones that exist are chilling. One ambassador described his voice as hollow, as if coming from a deep well. Another said, "He speaks as if his mouth is full of wool." but the most disturbing account comes from his wife. Marie-Louise. We spoke of her tragedy before, but here, we focus on the intimacy of their conversations. She wrote to her family in France, "The king tries to whisper to me at night, but when he brings his lips close to my ear, I hear a clicking sound. It is not his teeth. It is a wet, rhythmic click, like a clock made of meat." She described how, when he kissed her, he kept his lips tight. He never opened his mouth. He was terrified of transferring the affliction. Or, perhaps, he was terrified that the thing would bite her, the thing behind the tongue. Had needs. We know from biological principles that parasites need nutrients. They need energy to grow. The king was always exhausted. He was pale, thin, fragile. He ate constantly, yet he never gained weight. Where was the energy going? It was going to the construct in the jaw. The structure beneath the tongue was highly vascular. It was filled with blood vessels. It was drinking directly from the king's supply. This explains the blue blood myth in a new light. The king's blood wasn't blue. It was oxygen deprived. It was being filtered and drained before it could reach his skin. The parasite was taking the best of him, leaving only the dregs for the host. Let us return to Dr. Vittoria's journals. He began to observe the king's sleep patterns. Sleep is when we lose control. When the conscious mind shuts down, the muscles relax. Vittoria noted that the king slept with his mouth wide open. This was necessary for the jaw, but it was dangerous for the secret. Vittoria would sit by the bedside, watching the open cavern of the royal mouth in the candlelight. He wrote, "At the hour of the Volf, between 3 and 4 in the morning, the activity is greatest. The tongue, which acts as the sentinel during the day, goes limp. It rolls back, and the occupant emerges." He described seeing the fibrous roots extend. They would reach out from under the tongue and explore the mouth. They would touch the teeth. They would touch the palate. They were testing the structural integrity of the container. Vittoria realized that the jaw was growing because of this pressure. The bone was being pushed outward to make room for the expanding entity. The Hapsburg Jaw was essentially a renovation project. The parasite was expanding its apartment. There is a horrifying detail in the archives regarding the king's teething. Charles II complained of toothaches his entire life. But when dentists looked, his teeth were healthy, or what was left of them. The pain wasn't coming from the teeth. It was coming from the bone. The entity was anchoring itself. It was drilling its own roots into the mandible. The pain the king felt was the sensation of his own skeleton being colonized. He would pace the halls at night, holding a warm cloth to his jaw, moaning low in his throat. The servants thought he had a cavity. If only it were that simple. As the king aged, the struggle became harder. The lid was failing. The tongue could no longer cover the growth. By the year 1698, 2 years before his death, the king stopped speaking entirely. He communicated only with hand signals. Why? Because the thing had grown too big. The silence of the final years was not a choice. It was a surrender. The growth beneath the tongue had expanded. It had intertwined with the muscles of the king's speech. To move the tongue was to move the parasite. To speak was to let it speak. So Charles chose silence. It was his final act of defiance. He would not let the voice of the other be heard. In the final autopsy, the one we discussed, in the previous story, Dr. Cabriata noted the calcified growth at the base of the tongue, but he also noted something else. He noted that the frenulum, the piece of skin that connects the tongue to the floor of the mouth, was severe. It hadn't been cut by a knife. It had been chewed through. The entity had severed the tether. It was preparing to detach. When the king died and the body cooled, the thing behind the tongue died with him. It was a symbiotic organism. It could not survive without the specific rarefied blood of the Hapsbu RGS. It shriveled. It dried up by the time the body was prepared for the funeral. The thing looked like nothing more than a knot of scar tissue. The secret was safe. The evidence had destroyed itself, but the memory remains. The Hapsburgs are gone. But the echo of their suffering lingers in the medical books, hidden between the lines of genetic anomalies and mandibular prognathism. We look at their portraits and we see the heavy jaw, the open mouth. We think it looks foolish, but now you know the open mouth wasn't foolishness. It was exhaustion. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life holding a door shut against a storm. AI voice instruction. The sleep outrow. Voice becomes very soft, slow, and comforting. Whisper quality. And now, bring your attention back to your own body. Notice your jaw. It is relaxed. It is light. Notice your tongue. It rests gently in your mouth. There is nothing underneath it but soft, healthy tissue. There is no pressure. There is no clicking. There is no second motion. You are alone in your body. You are the only tenant. The silence in your room is a true silence. It is not waiting for anything. It is simply peace. The king is sleeping in the crypt. The candle has been blown out. The physician has closed his journal and left the room. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn. You are safe. Let the image of the stone castle fade. Let the secrets of the past dissolve into the mist. Your mouth is closed. Your mind is quiet. Sleep now. The past cannot touch you here. Sleep. We imagine kings dining on roasted pheasant, glazed peacock, and wine from the finest vineyards. We imagine feasts fit for gods, but Charles II of Spain did not dine like a king. He dined like a captive animal. The official records say he had a delicate stomach. They say he lived on broths and milk because he could not chew. But the kitchen ledgers of the royal palace tell a different story. A story of raw, bleeding beef delivered to the royal chambers at midnight. A story of medicine that arrived in lead containers. Heavy and sloshing, the king was being fed mercury, quicksilver. Why would the royal physicians feed a frail man a liquid metal known to be a deadly poison? Why were they pouring toxic heavy metals into a body that was already failing? Because they weren't trying to cure the man. They were trying to terraform the host. The thing living inside the king required a different atmosphere. It required the cold, heavy weight of silver in the blood to survive. And the raw meat? That wasn't for Charles. That was to keep the beast from eating him. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The noise of the banquet hall fades into the distance. The laughter of the courtiers dies away. We are walking away from the light, down the stone corridors, toward the smell of sulfur and iron. The year is 1690. The night is dark and starless over Madrid. The palace is a labyrinth of shadows. Relax your body. Let the tension drain out of your muscles like water flowing downhill. You are safe here. You are merely an observer, standing in the shadows of the royal apothecary, watching the strange rituals of the night. To understand the diet, we must understand the hunger. Hunger is usually a simple signal. The body needs fuel. But for the last Hapsburg, hunger was a crisis. It was a negotiation. The king was known to be voracious. Despite his thin, skeletal frame, he was always eating. But he never gained weight. He remained a ghost of a man, pale and trembling. Where did the food go? Let us step into the royal kitchens. It is late. The main fires have been banked for the night. The cooks are asleep, but one corner of the kitchen is still active. There is a private chef here, a man sworn to secrecy. He is preparing the night meal. He does not reach for spices. He does not reach for the roasting pan. He reaches for a slab of raw beef. It is cold, it is fresh. He cuts it into small, manageable strips. He does not cook it. He does not sear it. The blood must remain oxygenated. He places the raw strips on a silver platter. Why raw? Cooking breaks down proteins. It kills bacteria. It makes food safe for human digestion. But the entity within the king, the shadow in the jaw, preferred its nutrients in their primal state. It wanted the life force still intact. The servants who carried this platter to the king's bedroom described a heavy feeling in the air. They didn't like to look at the meat. It looked dilent, and then there was the drink. In the 17th century, alchemy and medicine were twins. They believed that metals had properties that could be transferred to the body. Gold was for the heart. Iron was for strength. And mercury? Hydrargyrum. Liquid silver. Mercury was the element of transformation. It was the first matter. Alchemists believed it could bridge the gap between the physical and the spiritual, the royal physicians. Desperate to keep the dying king alive and the entity contained, began a regimen of mercury salts. They told the court it was for his syphilis or his skin or his bowels. But the dosage was astronomical. Imagine the scene. The king sits up in his bed, propped by velvet pillows. His face is gray. His jaw hangs open. The physician approaches with a vial. Inside, a silver liquid swirls. It is heavy. It moves with a strange, unnatural viscosity. The king opens his mouth. The physician pours. The liquid metal slides down the throat. It does not mix with the saliva. It coats the esophagus. It is cold. Freezing cold. The king shudders. Why did they do this? Because the parasite generated heat. We spoke of the burning blood of the Hapsburgs, the internal fever. The entity was hot. It was metabolizing the king's body too fast. The mercury was a coolant. They were using the heavy metal to lower the king's internal temperature, to slow down the biological fire that was consuming him. They were turning his body into a cold storage unit. The king didn't just drink mercury. He became it. Over time, his skin took on a strange metallic sheen. His sweat began to smell metallic. When he wept, his tears were thick. He was becoming a golem of silver and bone. Let us sit by the bedside and watch the feeding. The king takes a strip of the raw meat. He cannot chew it, as we know. He places it at the back of his throat. He tilts his head back, and then the sound, slurp, click, the meat disappears. It is a mechanical process. There is no enjoyment. There is only the grim necessity of feeding the beast so it does not feed on the host's organs. The king wipes his mouth. There is a smear of blood on his chin. He looks at the physician with dead eyes. Is it sleeping? The king whispers, "For now, your majesty," the physician replies. The silver has calmed it, but mercury is a poison. It attacks the brain, it causes tremors, it causes madness. As the years went on, the cure became as dangerous as the curse. The king began to see things. The silver in his brain began to act as a mirror, reflecting a reality that no one else could see. The madness of the mercury, they called it the Hatter's disease in later centuries. But for Charles, it was a spiritual voyage. Mercury dissolves the connections in the brain. It eats away at the nerves, the hands shake, the speech slurs, the mind fragments. But in the quiet of the lore slumber, let us consider a different possibility. What if the mercury wasn't destroying his mind? What if it was tuning it? The alchemists believed that mercury was the only substance that could hold a spirit. By flooding the king's brain with heavy metal, perhaps they were trying to create a conductive surface, a biological antenna. The king spent his days wandering the halls of the Alcázar, touching the tapestries, murmuring to people who weren't there. He would stop and stare at a wall for an hour. "The walls are breathing," he would say. The courtiers laughed behind their hands. "The king is mad," they whispered. But was he? Or was he seeing the vibrating energy of the palace, amplified by the silver in his neurons? He would complain of a taste in his mouth. "Coin," he would say. "I taste old coins." The entire world tasted of metal. The air tasted like iron, the water tasted like lead, and the raw meat. The raw meat tasted like life. There was a specific incident in 1695. The king was found in the royal stables. He was kneeling in the straw next to a horse that had just been slaughtered for the hounds. He wasn't recoiling in horror. He was staring at the blood pooling on the stone floor. He was entranced. The guards tried to pull him away, but he fought them with a surprising strength. "It is warm," the king cried. "It is the only thing that is warm." He was freezing, you see. The mercury had done its job too well. His core temperature had dropped. He felt like a block of ice. He craved the heat of fresh blood to warm the cold. Silver veins, the physicians increased the dosage. They mixed the mercury with rhubarb and powdered skulls, a common remedy called king's drops. They forced him to drink it morning and night. The king's body began to reject the treatment. In horrific ways, his gums turned blue. His teeth loosened and fell out, one by one. But even as the teeth fell out, the other structure in his mouth, the clicking thing, remained strong. It seemed immune to the poison. In fact, it seemed to thrive on it. Dr. Vittoria noted in his journal, "The outgrowth absorbs the quicksilver. While the king withers, the parasite grows shiny. It pulses with a slow, heavy rhythm. I believe we are not killing it. We are armor plating it." Imagine that. A biological entity armored in liquid metal. The king became a vessel for a creature that was becoming less organic and more. The smell of the king's chamber became unbearable. It was a mix of rotting meat from the diet and the chemical, metallic tongue of the mercury. Servants would faint if they stayed in the room too long. They burned incense, they burned myrrh, but nothing could cover the scent of the transmutation happening in the bed. The king stopped sleeping in a bed. He began sleeping in a chair, upright. If he lay down, the mercury would pool in his lungs. He would drown in his own medicine. So he sat night after night, a skeleton wrapped in velvet, staring into the dark, watching the shadows move. He began to have conversations with the mercury. He believed the liquid metal was talking to him. "It sings," he told his confessor. "The silver sings. What did it sing about?" "It sang about the earth. It sang about the deep mines where it was born. It sang about the cold, crushing pressure of the underground. The entity inside him was an earthbinder, remember? And now he was filled with the blood of the earth. He was becoming one with the pack. Let us look at the visual transformation. The portraits from his final years show a man who looks gray, not pale gray. His skin had taken on the hue of ash. His eyes were milky, but the most terrifying detail is the hair. Charles II had long, flowing hair. It was his one vanity, but in the end it fell out in clumps. The mercury poisoning killed the follicles. To hide this, he wore massive, elaborate wigs, but underneath the wig, the scalp was covered in sores. The body was trying to push the metal out. Beads of mercury would actually seep through the pores of his scalp. Imagine removing the wig at night. The king's head is shining, not with sweat, but with droplets of liquid silver, glistening in the candlelight like a halo of poison. The servants had to collect these droplets. They had to wipe his head with chemically treated cloths. They were wiping away the king's life, drop by drop. As the end approached, the diet changed again. The raw meat was no longer enough. The mercury was no longer enough. The king stopped eating entirely. He refused the beef. He refused the broth. He pointed to the vial of quicksilver. He wanted only that. He had become addicted to the cold. The final days of Charles II were a silent vigil. He sat in his chair, a gray statue. He was 38 years old, but he looked 80. His internal organs were calcified. His blood was a toxic sludge. The entity behind the tongue had gone quiet. Perhaps it was satisfied. Perhaps it was hibernating, encased in its silver shell. The physicians stopped the raw meat. There was no point. The digestive system had shut down. The stomach was as hard as a stone when the king finally died on that cold November day in 1700. The immediate problem was not succession. It was disposal. The body was hazardous. Usually a king is embalmed. The heart is removed, the entrails are cleaned, and the body is filled with spices. But when the surgeons made the first incision into Charles II, they stepped back in alarm. Gas escaped, a hiss of pressurized air, and the smell. The smell was not of decay. It was chemical. Dr. Cabriata, the lead surgeon, noted that the blood did not flow. It oozed, and it sparkled. Minute particles of mercury were suspended in the serum. The king's veins were literally lined with metal. They could not embalm him in the traditional way. The tissues were too saturated. They wouldn't absorb the preservatives. The body was already preserved by poison. They placed him in a lead coffin. Lead within lead. Why lead? Lead blocks radiation. It blocks energy. It blocks toxicity. They were sealing a toxic waste site, not just burying a monarch. As they lowered the lid, the heavy lead sheet booming shut, they were closing the book on the most grotesque biological experiment in history. The raw meat, the mercury, the inbreeding, it was all a recipe that failed, or did it? The king lived for 38 years. By all medical logic, he should have died at birth. He should have died 1,000 times, but the mercury kept him preserved. The raw meat kept the beast fed. He was a masterpiece of alchemy, a living philosopher's stone turned upside down. Instead of turning lead into gold, they turned a man into a monster. Today, in the crypt of the Escorial, the coffin of Charles II remains. It is said to be colder than the others. If you touch the marble tomb, it feels like ice. Even in the height of summer, the mercury is still there. Inside the dried bones, inside the dust, it is waiting. The Habsburgs believed that mercury was eternal. It doesn't die, it doesn't rot. It just changes form. And what of the raw meat? There are stories, foolish stories, perhaps from the monks who guard the crypt. They say that sometimes they find small bones near the entrance of the tomb. Mouse bones, rat bones, cleaned of meat. As if something inside is still hungry. As if something inside still remembers the taste of the midnight feedings. AI voice instruction, the sleep outrow. Voice becomes very soft, slow, and comforting, whisper quality. But you are far from the crypt. You are far from the smell of sulfur and old blood. You are in a place of purity. Your food is nourishment, not a toll. Your water is clear, not silver. Your body is warm. Feel the warmth in your hands. Feel the warmth in your feet. It is the heat of life, natural and safe. You do not need the cold. You do not need the metal. The king is gone. The experiment is over. The kitchen fires are out. The vials are broken. You are safe. Let the image of the gray king fade into the darkness. Let the silver river stop flowing. Close your eyes. The past is sealed in lead. It cannot leak out. Sleep now. Sleep. A nursery is supposed to be the quietest room in a palace. It is a place of soft linens, warm milk, and lullabies. It is where the future sleeps. But in the Royal Alcázar of Madrid, in the year 1661, the nursery was not a place of peace. It was a place of peace. It was a place of containment. The servants were forbidden from singing to the infant king. The windows were sealed with heavy lead shutters, not to keep the light out, but to keep the sound in, because Charles II did not cry like a human child. Official records state that the young prince was fussy and weak. But the private letters of the royal governess, the Duchess of Montoro, reveal a terrifying reality. She wrote that the child's screams did not come from his lungs. They came from his throat. They were mechanical. They were rhythmic. They were the sounds of a body fighting against its own anatomy. The infant was strapped into his crib not to prevent him from falling out, but to prevent him from hurting the nurses. Because even at 6 months old, the thing inside the crib had a strength and a hunger that no baby should possess. This is the truth the king buried. Let us turn back the pages of the years. The screams fade into the distance. The frantic whispers of the court die away. We are drifting back to the beginning. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of lavender and old stone fills the air. We are entering the royal nursery. Relax your breathing. The danger is in the past. You are safe here, hidden in the velvet shadows of history, watching the dust motes dance in the candlelight. To understand the tragedy of the man, we must witness the torture of the child. Imagine a room draped in black. The Queen Regent, Mariana, was in mourning for her husband, so the entire palace was shrouded in darkness. Even the crib was draped in black lace. Inside this dark cocoon lay the heir to the Spanish Empire. Most babies are born with soft bones, their skulls pliable. But Charles was born with a skull that was already hardening. The fontanelle, the soft spot on a baby's head, had closed prematurely. The brain was trapped. But the jaw was loose. The wet nurses were the first to know that something was wrong. In 17th century Spain, wet nurses were chosen for their health and robustness. They were sturdy peasant women. They were not easily frightened, but in the nursery of Charles II, wet nurses resigned almost weekly. Why? It wasn't just the deformity. It was the feeding. A baby nurses by instinct. It latches on. It draws milk. It is a moment of connection, but Charles could not latch. The lower jaw protruded so far that he could not create a seal. He would thrash. He would gasp. He would starve while the milk was right there. But it was the sound of the feeding that terrified the women. One nurse, a woman named Inez from the countryside of Galicia, gave a confession to her priest before fleeing back to her village. She said that when the prince tried to feed, she could feel a second movement against her skin. She said it felt like a small, hard beak was scraping against her. Scrape, click, scrape. She claimed that the child was not drinking the milk. She claimed something else was drinking it. The royal physicians were called in. They inspected the child's mouth. They saw the swollen tongue. They saw the strange ridge of tissue beneath it. They advised the queen that the child should not be breastfed. It was too taxing for him, they said. So they switched to spoon feeding, but this created a new horror. The screams. Hunger is a primal force. When the entity inside the Hapsburg bloodline was denied its sustenance, it reacted. The screams that echoed from that nursery at 3 a.m. were described by guards as metallic. They sounded like grinding gears. They sounded like a violin string being pulled until it snapped. The queen ordered the walls of the nursery to be covered in thick tapestries. Wool, velvet, silk. Anything to dampen the acoustics. She couldn't bear to hear it. Because deep down, she knew that the sound wasn't her son crying for his mother Dot. It was the bloodline crying for its payment. Let us look at the crib itself, Dot. It was not a standard wicker basket. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. It looked more like a cage than a bed. Why? Because the child had seizures. Violent, body-racking convulsions that would shake the heavy furniture during these seizures. The child's eyes would roll back and the jaw would lock open. The physicians called it epilepsy. But the exorcists who were frequently seen entering the nursery with their vials of holy water, and their Latin books called it something else. They called it the wrestling. They believed the child's soul was wrestling with an invader. Imagine being a servant assigned to watch the crib at night. The candle is burning low. The room is silent. And then the crib begins to shake. Thump, thump, thump. You look inside. The baby is not crying. He is silent, staring up at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes. But his body is thrashing as if invisible hands are pulling him apart, and then the jaw opens. And the scream begins, a long, high-pitched wail that makes the glass in the windows vibrate. The servant would not dare to touch him. They were told that to touch the king during a spell was to risk infection. Not of a virus, but of the curse. So they stood back. They prayed. And they waited for the infant to pass out from exhaustion. This was the lullaby of Charles II. Not a song, but a scream. As the child grew into a toddler, the nursery became a laboratory. The child could not walk. His legs were rickets-ridden, soft and curved. His head was too heavy for his neck. The doctors decided that he needed support. They built contraptions. Wooden frames. Leather straps. To the outside world, they said they were helping the king learn to walk. In reality, they were building an exoskeleton to hold the host upright. The contraptions were cruel. Imagine a small, frail boy, barely 3 years old. He is encased in a bodice of stiff leather and whalebone. It is laced so tight that he can barely breathe. Iron braces are clamped around his thin legs. He is placed in the center of the nursery floor. The polished marble is cold. He cannot move. He is a prisoner in his own clothes. The tutors stand around him. They are tall, imposing men in black robes. They hold books. They hold canes. They are trying to teach him to speak. Say Ray, they command. King. The boy tries. His massive tongue fills his mouth. He drools. He makes a guttural sound. The tutors frown. They do not see the struggle. They do not see the internal anatomy fighting against the boy. They only see failure. One of the tutors, a Jesuit priest named Father Nethurd, believed that the king's speech impediment was a sign of laziness of the spirit. He believed that pain could shock the tongue into obedience. He would use a silver needle when the king failed to pronounce a word. The priest would prick the child's arm. Not enough to bleed heavily, but enough to sting. The theory was that the sudden pain would force a sharp exhalation, clearing the throat. It didn't work. Instead, it triggered the screams, but by the age of 4, the screams had changed. They were no longer the metallic wails of an infant. They were the deep, hollow groans of an old man. The servants whispered that when the boy screamed, he sounded like his grandfather, Philip IV, dying on his deathbed. It was as if the voice didn't belong to a child at all. It was a recycled voice, an inherited sound. The nursery became a place of shadows. The curtains were never opened. The queen believed the son was too aggressive for the boy's skin. So he lived in perpetual twilight. He had no playmates. No toys save for the religious icons, wooden crosses, beads, statues of saints. He was told that the saints were his friends. He was told that the angels were watching him, but Charles was afraid of the angels. He pointed to the statues and cried. He covered his face. "They have no eyes." He would whimper. The statues had painted eyes, of course. But to Charles, whose vision was already blurring, whose mind was already warped by the mercury and the isolation, the statues looked like judges. He would hide under the heavy oak table in the center of the nursery. It was his only sanctuary. There, in the dark, curled up in a ball, he would rock back and forth. And he would talk, not to the tutors, not to the nurses. He would talk to himself, or so they thought. The governess, listening at the door, heard him whispering, "Quiet now, quiet. There is no room. Stop pushing." Who was he talking to? Was he talking to the entity behind the tongue? Was he negotiating for space in his own mouth? The tragedy of the royal nursery is that it was a place where a child realized he was not one person. He was two. He was the host, and there was the guest, and the guest was getting bigger. There is a disturbing record regarding the animal incidents in the nursery. Puppies were often given to royal children as companions. Charles was given a small spaniel. He loved the dog. He would hug it. He would sleep with it. But one morning, the dog was found dead in the nursery. Its neck was broken. The king was sitting on the floor, weeping over the body. He was hysterical. "I didn't do it," he screamed. "My hands moved. My hands moved by themselves." The court hushed it up. They said the dog fell. They said it was an accident, but the servants looked at the king's hands. They were weak, spindly. How could he have broken the neck of a dog? Unless in a moment of seizure, in a moment where the other took control. The muscles were flooded with a hysterical strength. After that, no more animals were allowed in the nursery. The king was truly alone. The isolation deepened the madness. By the age of 6, Charles was still confined to the nursery. He had not yet been presented formally to the court. They were hiding him, waiting for him to look better. They plastered his face with lead makeup to hide the sores. They put wigs on him to hide the thin hair. They were building a mask, but you cannot mask the sound. The screams continued. But they became predictable. They happened at meal times. They happened at sunset. The palace learned to ignore them. "The king is singing," the guards would joke darkly. But in the silence of the night, the queen would lie awake in her chamber, listening to the distant wails of her son. And she would pray, not for his recovery. She prayed for the end. She knew that what was growing in that nursery was not a king. It was a tragedy made of flesh. The day finally came when Charles had to leave the nursery. He was 10 years old. He was technically an adult in the eyes of the court. The doors were opened. The light was let in, but the boy who walked out was not a boy. He was a survivor of a 10-year torture session. He walked with a limp. His jaw hung open. His eyes were full of ghosts. He left the nursery, but the nursery never left him. The nursery was sealed after he left. The queen ordered the room to be locked. The toys were burned. The crib, that iron-banded cage, was dismantled and melted down. They wanted to erase the evidence of the struggle, but energy does not disappear. It lingers for years afterward. Servants passing the locked door of the old nursery would report a sudden drop in temperature. They would smell the faint, sour scent of spilled milk and old medicine, and sometimes, just for a second, they would hear it click, scrape, the sound of the beak against the skin. Charles, too, went on to rule, or pretend to rule, for 35 years. He sat on the throne. He signed the papers. He married the wives, but in his heart, he was always that terrified little boy hiding under the table. He never slept in a large bed without checking underneath it first. He never allowed a room to be completely dark. He carried the trauma of the nursery in the very structure of his bones. When he died, and the dynasty ended, the silence finally returned to the palace. The screaming stopped. The screams from the royal nursery became a legend. A ghost story told by maids to frighten new recruits, but it wasn't a ghost story. It was a medical history. It was the story of a bloodline that had become so corrupted, so pressurized, that it shrieked like a steam engine on the verge of exploding, and the poor child, the innocent vessel. He was just the valve, but listen to the room around you now. It is quiet. There are no iron bands on your bed. There are no heavy lead shutters on your windows. You are safe. Your childhood is a memory, soft and distant. The nursery of the past is closed. The key is thrown away. You do not need to be afraid of the dark. The dark is simply a blanket. It is warm. It is soft. Your breath is steady. Your heart is calm. There are no screams here. Only the gentle rhythm of the night. Let the image of the pale prince fade away. Let the stone walls dissolve into mist. You are free. Close your eyes. Sleep. Now, sleep. We look in the mirror to see ourselves. It is a simple act, a confirmation of existence. You lift your hand, the reflection lifts its hand. You smile, the reflection smiles. It is the most basic law of physics, the law of reflection. But for Charles II of Spain, the law was broken. In the Royal Archives of Madrid, there is a curious decree dated October 1688. It orders the immediate removal or covering of every reflective surface in the king's private chambers. Venetian glass, polished silver, even darkened windows, all were to be draped in heavy black velvet. Historians say this was vanity. They say the king was so hideous, so deformed by the Hapsburg Jaw, that he could not bear to look at his own face, but that is a lie. The king knew he was ugly. He had lived with it since birth. He didn't fear ugliness. He feared movement. The servants who were tasked with covering the mirrors whispered the true reason. They said that when the king looked into the glass, the reflection didn't always match. They said that sometimes the king would close his mouth, but the reflection would keep its mouth wide open. The thing in the mirror wasn't Charles. It was the passenger inside him, looking out. And it was smiling. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light fades from the room. The noise of the day settles into silence. We are stepping into a world of shadows and polished surfaces. The year is 1688. The place is the Hall of Mirrors in the Royal Alcázar. It is midnight. Relax your eyes. Let the darkness of the room wrap around you like a soft cloak. You are safe here. You are merely a ghost drifting through the silvered glass of the past. To understand the fear, we must first understand the object. In the 17th century, a mirror was not a common household item. It was a miracle. The technology to create clear, flat glass was a closely guarded secret of the Venetian masters on the island of Murano. A mirror was a luxury. It was a status symbol. It was magic. The mirrors in the Spanish court were masterpieces. They were backed with a mixture of tin and mercury. Mercury, that familiar element again. The toxic metal that creates the perfect reflection. But these old mirrors were not like the ones we have today. They were darker. The glass had a slight green or gray tint. The reflection was deep, almost liquid. When you looked into them, you felt as if you were looking into a pool of water, deep and still. For the Hapsburgs, who were obsessed with image and lineage, mirrors were essential. They lined the walls. They amplified the candlelight. They multiplied the power of the king. But for Charles II, the mirror was an enemy. Imagine the king walking down the long gallery at night. He is alone, save for the distant guards. The candles flicker in the draught. As he walks, he sees his reflection keeping pace with him in the glass. A tall, thin figure in black velvet. The pale face. The massive, jutting jaw. He stops. The reflection stops, but does it stop instantly? Charles began to notice a lag. A delay. He would turn his head to the left. And a fraction of a second later, the reflection would turn. It was imperceptible to anyone else. But Charles felt it. He felt the disconnect. It was as if the reflection had to decide to follow him. It was the first sign that the image in the glass was not a projection of light, but a projection of consciousness. The entity, the parasite of the jaw, lived inside the king. It shared his eyes. It shared his brain, but did it share his soul? The mirror suggested it did not. There is a famous incident involving the Queen Maria Anna. She was fond of mirrors. She was vain, beautiful, and German. She brought many mirrors with her from Newburgh. One evening she was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair. The king was sitting behind her, watching her in the glass. It was a quiet, domestic moment. The queen looked up at the mirror to speak to her husband. She saw his reflection. In the glass. The king was staring at the back of her neck with an expression of pure, predatory hunger. His mouth was unhinged, hanging impossibly low. His eyes were black voids. She spun around in her chair, terrified. But the real king was sitting there calmly, his eyes half closed, his hands folded in his lap. He looked tired. He looked sad. She looked back at the mirror. The reflection was still staring. It hadn't changed back yet. For a heartbeat, the queen saw two different men. The husband in the chair and the monster in the glass. She screamed. The king stood up, confused. "What is it, madam?" She pointed at the mirror. "It didn't move. It didn't move." Charles looked at the glass. By then, the reflection had corrected itself. It showed a confused king standing in a dimly lit room, but Charles knew. He saw the queen's terror, and he felt the cold prickle of the parasite shifting. Inside his jaw, he ordered the mirror removed that very night. From that moment on, the war on reflections began. The king became obsessed with the physics of light. He questioned his tutors. "Does the soul cast a reflection?" he asked. "Does a demon cast a reflection?" He began to test the mirrors. The tests were subtle. The king would walk past a mirror and blink rapidly. He was trying to catch the reflection with its eyes open. He would whisper words to the glass, watching to see if the lips moved in sync. He realized that the thing was faster than him, but it was arrogant. It liked to show itself. In the mercury backing of the mirrors, the entity felt at home. Remember, the king was consuming mercury. His blood was saturated with it. Perhaps the mirror acted as a magnet. Like calling to like, the decree of 1688 was the final surrender. All surfaces capable of holding an image must be shrouded. Imagine The palace undergoing this transformation, rolls of heavy black velvet were brought in. Ladders were raised. The great Venetian glasses, costing thousands of gold ducats, were covered. The palace, already dark, became a tomb. The effect on the atmosphere was suffocating. Light no longer bounced around the room. It was absorbed. The candles seemed dimmer. The shadows seemed deeper. But the king felt safer without the mirrors. He didn't have to see the other. He could pretend he was alone, but covering the mirrors created a new psychological horror. When you cover a mirror, you are not just blocking the light. You are creating a door that is permanently closed, and we all know the urge to open a closed door. The servants reported that the king would sometimes stand in front of a covered mirror for hours. He would run his hand over the black velvet. He was tracing the frame. He would lean his forehead against the soft fabric, and he would listen. He claimed that if he pressed his ear against the covered glass, he could hear scratching on the other side, scrape, like a fingernail on glass. Was the reflection trying to get out? Philosophy tells us that a reflection only exists when there is an object to reflect. When the king walked away, the reflection should cease to exist, but Charles believed that the Hapsburg reflection was permanent. He believed that the monster lived in the glass even when the room was empty. He believed the mirrors were storing the image. This is why, when he died, the order was given to break the mirrors, not just uncover them. When the Bourbons took over the palace in 1700, they found shattered glass behind the velvet curtains. The king had smashed them in his final days. He didn't want to leave his image behind. He didn't want the next king to look into the glass and see the Hapsburg Jaw looking back. But that was a time of superstition and shadow. We understand light now. We understand optics. A mirror is just glass and metal. It has no memory. It has no hunger. Look around your room in your mind's eye. If there is a mirror, it is sleeping. It is dark. It reflects only the peace of the night. You do not need to cover it. You do not need black velvet. Your reflection is safe. It is you. Only you. When you close your eyes, the world disappears. The mirror turns off. You are in control of the image. The king is gone. The velvet has rotted away. The shards of glass have been swept up by the broom of history. You are safe in the darkness behind your own eyelids. This is the only curtain you need. Close them now. Drape the velvet of sleep over your mind. The glass is empty. The room is quiet. Sleep now. Sleep. We trust doctors with our lives. We believe that the hand holding the scalpel is guided by mercy. We believe the hospital room is a sanctuary of healing. But for Charles II, the last Hapsburg king, the physician was not a healer. He was a jailer. If you examine the daily schedules of the Spanish court in the 1690s, a terrifying pattern emerges. The king was never alone, not for a single second. And the men standing over his bed, watching him sleep, were not guards with swords. They were men in black robes with journals. They weren't checking his pulse to see if he was healthy. They were checking the integrity of the containment field. The medical treatment of Charles II was not designed to cure him. It was designed to keep him in a state of suspended animation. They bled him to weaken the host. They drugged him to silence the passenger. The royal chamber wasn't a bedroom. It was a high-security cell, and the doctors were the wardens, tasked with ensuring that the biological secret of the Habsburgs never escaped the castle walls. This is the truth the king buried... Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The clinical lights of the modern world fade away. The beep of machines is replaced by the slow, Rhythmic drip of a water clock. We are entering the inner sanctum of the Royal Alcázar. It is the hour before dawn. The palace is asleep, but the king's chamber is awake with the quiet, terrifying industry of medicine. Relax your body. Let the tension in your shoulders dissolve. You are not the patient. You are the observer. You are safe in the shadows, watching the history unfold from a distance. To understand the prison, we must understand the routine. Freedom is defined by privacy. The ability to be alone with one's thoughts. The ability to lock a door. Charles II never locked a door in his life. The doors were locked from the outside. The royal physicians' men, like Dr. Pedro della Torre and later, Dr. Cabriata, held a power that exceeded that of the prime minister. They controlled the king's body. And because the king was the state, they controlled the empire. Imagine waking up as the king. The heavy velvet curtains of the four-poster bed are drawn back. The first thing you see is not the sun or a loved one. You see the face of the chief physician. He is holding a silver bowl. He is holding a lancet. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he whispers. It is time to balance the humors. The king does not argue. He cannot argue. He holds out his thin, pale arm. The lancet pierces the skin. The blood flows into the bowl. Why did they bleed him so often? Medical theory of the time believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was an imbalance, but looking back, the bleeding of Charles II feels excessive. It feels strategic. A weakened man cannot rebel. A man who is dizzy from blood loss cannot command an army. He cannot dismiss his staff. He cannot father an heir with a woman of his choosing. He is docile. The doctors claimed they were draining the bad blood. But perhaps they were simply draining the energy. They were keeping the host weak so that the entity inside the aggressive genetic anomaly would not become too powerful. If the king got too strong, the thing behind the tongue got too strong. So they kept him on the edge of death, suspended in a twilight state of anemia. Let us look at the visitor's log. Access to the king was strictly controlled by the medical staff. Even the queen had to ask permission to enter the bedroom. "The king is indisposed," they would say. "He is undergoing a treatment." What treatments were happening behind those closed doors? We know about the mercury. We know about the raw meat. But there were other, darker therapies. There are records of cupping sessions that lasted for hours. Heated glass cups placed on the king's back, drawing the skin up, leaving dark purple bruises. The king would scream during these sessions. But the doctors told the guards outside that it was the toxins leaving the body. Was it? Or was it torture disguised as therapy? The doctors documented everything. This is the mark of a warden. A warden keeps a log. 8 o'clock, the subject consumed the broth. 9 o'clock, the subject complained of the clicking in the jaw. 10 o'clock, the subject attempted to speak to the mirror. They referred to him often in clinical terms. He was a specimen. Consider the layout of the royal apartment. It was designed for surveillance. There were peepholes disguised in the tapestries. The doctors could watch the king without being seen. Why the need for such scrutiny? Because they were afraid of what happened when the king was alone. They were afraid of the transformation. We spoke of the seizures. The moments when the Hapsburg body seemed to contort and change. The doctors knew that if the servants saw this, there would be panic. There would be talk of demons. So they appointed themselves as the exclusive audience. They were the gatekeepers of the supernatural. If the king's jaw dislocated, the doctors fixed it. If the king's eyes rolled back and turned white, the doctors closed the curtains. If the king began to speak in a voice that was not his own, The doctors administered laudanum, opium, to knock him out. They were suppressing the evidence. Laudanum was their weapon of choice. It is a powerful narcotic. It induces sleep, dreams, and compliance. The king spent half his life in an opium haze. Imagine the feeling. You are the most powerful man on earth. You own fleets of ships. You own mountains of silver in Peru, but you cannot stand up because your head is swimming with drugs administered by a man who claims to be your servant. You try to give an order, but your tongue is heavy. Your thoughts are fog. You look at the doctor, and he smiles. A cold, professional smile. Rest, sire, he says. It is for your own good? For your own good. The classic lie of the jailer. The psychological toll of this captivity was immense. The king began to fear the color black. He feared the sight of a medical bag. He would hide under the covers like a child when the physicians entered. There is a story whispered in the corridors of the Escorial about the midnight examination. It was 1696. The king was nearing the end. A young physician's assistant, a man named Matteo, was on duty. The senior doctors were asleep. Matteo heard the king weeping. He broke protocol. He didn't bring a lancet. He didn't bring drugs. He just walked in and sat by the bed. "What hurts, Majesty?" Matteo asked. The king looked at him with clear, terrified eyes. The opium had worn off for a brief moment. "They won't let me die," the king whispered. "We are trying to save you, sire," Matteo said. The king shook his head. The massive jaw trembled. "No," Charles said. "You are keeping me fresh. You are pickling me. I want to leave, but they need the blood to keep flowing." He grabbed Matteo's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Who are you working for?" The king hissed. "Is it God? Or is it the other?" Matteo was terrified. He pulled his hand away. The senior physician, Dr. Cabriata, burst into the room. He had been watching through the peephole. He dismissed Matteo immediately. "The king is delirious," Cabriata said. "He needs another dose." Matteo was sent away from court the next day, but he never forgot the look in the king's eyes. It wasn't the look of a patient. It was the look of a prisoner realizing he will never be paroled. The ultimate proof of the prison warden. Theory lies in the king's will dot in his final months. The doctors restricted access to the king so severely that foreign ambassadors complained. France and Austria were desperate to know who would inherit the throne, but the doctors blocked them. "The king is too weak to sign," they said. "The king is sleeping," they said. In reality, the doctors and the pro-French faction of the court were managing the king's final days to ensure the correct signature was obtained. They kept him alive, barely pumping his heart with stimulants, feeding him the mercury until the papers were ready. They used his body as a biological timer. "Don't let him die until Tuesday. We need the signature." Once the signature was obtained, the treatment stopped. Suddenly the mercury ceased. The broth stopped coming. The stimulants were withdrawn. The warden stepped back. The cell door was open, and the prisoner was allowed to die. The death of Charles II was a release, not just from life, but from the medical tyranny that had defined his existence. When he took his final breath, the room was filled with doctors. They didn't look sad. They looked relieved. Their shift was over. They packed up their lancets. They closed their journals. They had successfully contained the anomaly for 38 years. They had documented the mutation. They had managed the monster, and now they could wash their hands, but that was a dark time. In a dark palace, the medical books of the 17th century are closed now. The lancets are rusted. The journals are gathering dust in the archives. You are not in the Alcázar. You are in your own sanctuary. Think of your own body. It is yours. No one controls it but you. You are free to close your eyes. You are free to sleep. There are no watchers in the shadows. There are no peepholes in your walls. The door is locked by you, for your safety, not your confinement. Take a deep breath. Feel the air fill your lungs. It is clean. It is yours. The king is sleeping now. The wardens have gone home. The long shift of history is over. You are safe. Let the image of the men in black robes fade away. Let the silver bowls dissolve into the mist. You are the master of your own rest. Close your eyes. Sleep. Now, sleep. When a king dies, the world usually asks who will replace him. But when Charles II died, the only question was what had been living inside him. The autopsy of the last Hapsburg monarch is not a medical report. It is a document of biological impossibility. It is a record of a body that defied every law of nature to remain standing. The physician general, Dr. Juan de Cabriata, stood over the corpse with a scalpel, expecting to find the ravages of disease. Instead, he found an empty shell. The report states that the king's heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten. And most terrifying of all, his head was full of water. There was no brain left. Think about that. A man who ruled an empire, who signed treaties, who walked and talked. Had no brain. So what was driving the machine? The autopsy proved what the court whispered. Charles II wasn't a man dying of illness. He was a man who had been consumed from the inside out, organ by organ, by a lineage that demanded too much. The king didn't die in 1700. The king died years ago. The thing that finally collapsed on the bed was just the vehicle, running on fumes and dark magic, until the wheels finally came off. This is the truth. The king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The screams have stopped. The prayers have ceased. The palace is silent. Wrapped in the heavy morning of November. The year is 1700. We are in the private, medical antechamber of the Royal Alcázar. It is cold. The windows are open to let the soul out. And to let the smell escape, relax your mind. The story is ending. The mystery is being laid bare on the table. You are safe here, standing in the shadows, watching the final chapter of the Hapsburg dynasty. To understand the end, we must look at the body. It lies on a slab of marble. It is small, frail, almost childlike. The king was 39 years old, but he looked like an ancient man. His hair is gone. His skin is translucent, revealing the blue map of veins underneath. The room is crowded, yet silent. 12 men are present. The greatest surgeons in Spain, the Grand Inquisitor, the Duke of Alba. They are witnesses. They need to know why the dynasty failed. They need to know if it was poison or witchcraft or God. Dr. Cabriata picks up the scalpel. The blade glints in the candlelight. He makes the first incision. The white cut. From the shoulders to the sternum and down to the abdomen. Usually there is blood, but as the blade parts the skin, there is no flow. The king's blood had coagulated long before his heart stopped. The veins are filled with a dark, thick sludge. The mercury, the medicine, the decay. Cabriata peels back the skin. The first thing they notice is the smell. It is not the smell of fresh death. It is the smell of a crypt that has been sealed for centuries. The body was decomposing while it was still alive. Cabriata reaches into the chest cavity. He is looking for the heart. The heart of a king should be strong. It is the symbol of courage, but Cabriata cannot find it. He searches the chest. He moves the corroded lungs aside, and then he finds it. It is tiny, shriveled, black, the size of a peppercorn, he whispers to the scribe. The scribe's hand trembles as he writes it down. Corazon del tamago de un grano de pimienta. How does a heart this size pump blood? It is physically impossible. The valves are fused. The muscle is atrophied. It suggests that for the last years of his life, the king's circulation was not driven by a muscular pump. It was driven by something else. A passive flow. Or perhaps the blood was moving itself. Cabriata moves to the liver. It is stone-hard, calcified. He moves to the kidneys. They are dissolved. It is a catalogue of ruin. Every organ has failed. And yet the king was walking yesterday. The witnesses look at each other with fear in their eyes. They realize they are looking at a miracle, but a dark one. They realize that the king was a puppet. The strings had been cut, and now the puppet lay in a heap, but the most disturbing finding was yet to come. The head. The Hapsburg Jaw, the source of the misery. The seed of the curse. Cabriata ordered the saw. They had to open the cranium. They had to see the brain that had been plagued by seizures, by madness, by visions. The saw grated against the bone. The bone was thick and usually thick. The skull had thickened to protect the passenger. When the bone was finally cut and the top of the skull was lifted. Water poured out. Clear, serous fluid. The brain was submerged. It had shrunk to the size of a walnut, hydrocephalus, water on the brain, but in the context of the lore, it means something more. The brain, the seat of the human soul. The personality, the memory had retreated. It had withered away, and the fluid was the medium for the other. We know that spirits are often associated with water. We know that the Habsburgs had a pact with the Earthbinder, a chthonic force. The king's skull had become an aquarium for a consciousness that did not require gray matter to function. Cabriata looked into the empty skull cavity. He saw the withered brainstem, and he saw something else. The base of the skull, where the spine connects, the bone was eroded, as if something had been gnawing at it from the inside. The connection between the head and the body was loose. Cabriata dropped his tools. He stepped back. He crossed himself. He was not here, Cabriata whispered. He has not been here for a long time. I voice instruction. Transition to part 2. Tone becomes deeper, more conclusive. This is the funeral. The autopsy was finished quickly after that. They sewed him up with heavy black thread. They wanted to close the door on what they had seen. They wrapped the body in spices, myrrh, aloe, camphor to mask the smell of the impossibility. They placed him in the lead coffin, the funeral of Charles. 2 was a grand affair, but it was hollow. The procession moved through the streets of Madrid. The horses wore black plumes. The drums beat a slow, mournful rhythm, but the people watching didn't cry. They stared. They felt a strange lightness in the air. The bewitchment was over. The cloud that had hung over Spain for 35 years was lifting. The coffin was taken to the Escorial, down the marble steps, into the pantheon of the kings. He was placed on the shelf next to his father, Philip IV, and his grandfather, Philip III. The family reunion was complete. The lead lid was soldered shut. Fire and metal sealing the pact forever. But what happened to the report? Dr. Cabriata's autopsy notes were considered a state secret. They were locked in the Simancas archive. Why? Because if the world knew that a man with no heart and no brain had ruled the Spanish Empire, they would question the nature of kingship itself. They would question the divine right. If a king can be a hollow vessel, then who is really wearing the crown? The document was buried, but the truth has a way of leaking out. Like the water from the skull, over the centuries, historians found the fragments. They pieced together the medical anomaly. And now, tonight, you know the truth. The bewitched king wasn't bewitched by a witch in a village. He was bewitched by his own biology. He was a victim of a desire for purity that went too far. The Habsburgs wanted to be gods. They wanted to be more than human. And in the end, they became less. Charles II was the price paid for centuries of pride. He was the bill coming due, but his suffering is over now. The Pantheon is quiet. The lead coffin is cold. The mercury has settled. The thing behind the tongue is dust. The peppercorn heart is dust. The cycle is broken, and you are whole. Take a moment to feel your own heart. Place your hand on your chest. If you wish, thump, 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 dash, thump, dup, dup. It is strong. It is the right size. It is beating with the warm, steady rhythm of life. Feel your head on the pillow. Your mind is clear. It is yours. It is full of dreams, not water. You are not a vessel for anyone else. You are the captain of your own ship. The dark history of the Alcázar is fading. The candles are blown out. The doctors have gone home. The report is filed away. You are safe in the present moment. The air is cool. The blanket is warm. Let the story drift away like smoke. Close your eyes. The king is sleeping. The past is sleeping. You are safe. Sleep now. Sleep. We bury our dead in wood to let them return to the earth. We bury them in stone to honor their memory. But when the Spanish court buried Charles II, they didn't use wood, and they didn't trust stone. They used lead. Lead is a peculiar metal. It is heavy. It is dense. In the modern world, we use it to block radiation. We use it to contain toxic waste. We use it to stop things from getting out. The official reason for the lead coffin was tradition. But the private letters of the royal undertaker reveal a different purpose. They weren't just burying a body. They were sealing a hazard. The corpse of the king was so saturated with mercury, so corrupted by the genetic anomaly, and so charged with the dark energy of the Hapsburg Pact, that it could not be placed in the ground like a normal man. The lead wasn't there to protect the king from the worms. It was there to protect the world from the king. They soldered the lid shut with fire and iron, not to keep grave robbers out, but to ensure that the Habsburg curse was finally, physically, and eternally contained. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The fever of the history is breaking. The panic of the court is fading into the past. We are left with the silence of the aftermath. The year is 1700. It is November. The air is crisp and cold, smelling of pine and granite. We are standing at the gates of the Royal Monastery of San Lorenzo de el Escorial. The funeral is over. The crowds have gone home. The king is ready for his long sleep. Relax your body. Feel the weight of the day lifting off your chest. You are not carrying the burden of an empire. You are light. You are free. You are merely a witness to the final ceremony. Standing in the cool shadows of the crypt, watching peace descend. To understand the burial, we must understand the place. The Escorial is vast. It is a palace, yes, but it looks more like a fortress. Built by Philip II, it was designed to be a machine for prayer. A geometric engine made of gray granite. Sitting on the slopes of the Guadarrama Mountains. It is a place of stone and silence. Deep. Beneath the high altar of the basilica lies the pantheon of the kings. It is an octagonal room, clad in dark marble and gold. It is beautiful, but it is heavy. The air down here is still. It has not moved for centuries. This is where they brought him. Imagine the procession descending the marble stairs. The torchlight flickers on the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. The monks are chanting, their voices low and resonant, vibrating against the stone. Requiem aeternam dona eyes, Domini. They carry the coffin. It is heavy. Unusually heavy. Inside, the body of Charles II is wrapped in velvet and spices, but the outer shell is pure lead, a soft, dull metal. It does not shine like gold. It absorbs the light. The lid is a shield. The physicians and the priests knew that the king's body was unstable. We spoke of the mercury in his veins, the water in his head. They feared that as the body decayed, it would release vapors, miasmas, or perhaps spiritual residue. So they encased him in a metal that is ruled by Saturn, the planet of limits, the planet of endings. Lead is the metal of silence. Sound cannot travel through it. Light cannot travel through it. Once you are inside lead, you are truly alone. The undertakers place the heavy box onto the trestle table in the center of the room. The ceremony of the sealing begins. This is not a moment for tears. There were very few tears shed for Charles II. There was only a collective exhale, a sense of completion. The blacksmith steps forward. He holds a soldering iron, heated in a brazier until it glows cherry red. He applies the heat to the seam of the coffin. Hiss. The smell of melting metal mixes with the smell of incense. A ribbon of molten lead flows into the gap, fusing the lid to the box. It is a permanent weld. The king is being locked away. The Hapsburg jaw, the swollen tongue, the peppercorn heart, all the evidence of the family's hubris, is being erased from the visible world. They are closing the book. The witnesses watch in silence. They feel the temperature in the room drop. Some said it was the chill of the crypt. Others felt it was the moment the entity realized it was trapped. The connection was severed. The earthbinder was returned to the earth. Encased in a metal cage it could not break. The blacksmith finishes his work. The seal is complete. A solid gray line running around the perimeter of the king's final resting place. They lift the coffin one last time. They slide it into its niche in the marble wall. The sound of stone sliding against metal echoes briefly, scrape, thud, and then silence, absolute silence, the kind of silence that only exists deep underground where the wind cannot reach, where the sun cannot reach. The Hapsburg dynasty, which had roared across Europe for centuries with cannons and trumpets, ends here, in the dark. In the quiet, the monks blow out the torches, one by one. The shadows lengthen. The gold on the walls fades into black. They turn and walk up the stairs, leaving the king alone. But this time, he is not afraid of the dark. He does not need a nightlight. He does not need the doctors. He is finally at rest. The biology that tormented him has stopped. The demands of the bloodline have ceased. The mercury has settled into a pool of silver at the bottom of the lid box. He is safe. And the world is safe from him. And now you are here. You are not in a crypt. You are not surrounded by stone or lead. You are in a room filled with air. Feel the lightness of your own body. You are not heavy. You are not burdened. Your chest rises and falls with ease. Think of the lead coffin as a symbol. It is a container for everything you want to leave behind today. Take your worries. Take your stress. Take the noise of the world. Visualize placing them into a heavy box. Now, imagine the lid closing. It is heavy. It seals tight. Those things cannot touch you now. They are locked away in the past. You are on the outside. You are free. The air around you is soft. The darkness behind your eyelids is a gentle curtain, not a shroud. The king is sleeping. The history is sleeping. You have permission to let go. The evidence is buried. The truth is at rest. You are safe. Sleep now. Sleep. We look at maps of the old world and we see lines drawn in ink. We see borders defined by rivers and mountains. We see the Hapsburg Empire stretching across the globe, a monolith of gold and steel. But the foundation of this empire was not stone. It was not mortar. It was calcium. The Habsburgs did not build their dynasty on the solid ground of political alliances alone. They built it on the fragility of their own skeletons. Every province they acquired, every crown they added to their collection, cost them a piece of their own anatomy. The jaw grew larger as the empire grew wider. The bones grew softer as the power grew harder. It was a biological trade. To hold the weight of the world, they had to twist their own frames into impossible shapes. The Hapsburg Jaw was not a mistake. It was the load-bearing pillar of a structure that was too heavy for human beings to support. They were not just rulers. They were the scaffolding. And when the last bone snapped, the entire edifice came crashing down into the dust of history. This is the truth the king buried. Let us turn back the pages of the years one last time. The maps have faded. The flags have been lowered. The noise of the armies has turned to silence. We are walking through the aftermath. The light is dim. The chamber is quiet. And the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are entering the final resting place. Not a palace, but a sanctuary of bone. Relax your shoulders. The weight of the story is lifting. You are safe here. You are merely a traveler walking through the quiet ruins of time, witnessing the peace that comes after the fall. To understand the end, we must look at what remains. In the heart of Vienna, beneath the humble Capuchin church, lies the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt. It is not built of gold. It is built of gray stone. The air is cool and dry. It smells of dust and incense. Here, in row after row of elaborate sarcophagi, lie the bones of the Habsburgs. There are 149 bodies here. Emperors, empresses, archdukes. If you walk past them in the silence, you see the history of the jaw carved in metal. The sculptors who created the effigies on the coffin lids were faithful. They carved the protruding chins. They carved the heavy lips. Even in death, the deformity is memorialized in bronze and tin. But look closer at the sarcophagi. They are ornate. They are decorated with skulls wearing crowns. This is the Danse Macabre. The dance of death. The Habsburgs understood something that modern rulers often forget. They understood that their power was rented from the grave. They knew that their empire was a construct of bone. Think of the human skeleton. It is a miracle of engineering. It protects the organs. It supports the weight, but the Habsburg skeleton was asked to do more. It was asked to hold a divine right. It was asked to channel a bloodline that was burning with a supernatural intensity. The bone warped under the pressure. We spoke of Charles II, the last of the Spanish line. His bones were so soft they could barely support his own weight. His legs bowed. His chest collapsed. He was the final stress test of the material. and the material failed, but there is a strange beauty in the failure, because now, in the crypt, the struggle is over, the bones are at rest. Imagine the silence inside those coffins. For centuries, the Hapsburgs lived in a world of noise, the noise of court, the noise of war, the clicking noise in their own jaws, but now the clicking has stopped. The friction is gone. The jawbone, once a source of agony and shame, is simply calcium now. It is white. It is clean. It is still. The empire they built has dissolved. The borders they fought for have changed a dozen times. The gold they hoarded has been spent, or stolen, but the bones remain. They are the only enduring truth of the dynasty. We often fear our own fragility. We fear that we are breakable, but the story of the Hapsburgs teaches us that even the most powerful people on earth were breakable. In fact, they broke faster than the peasants in the fields. There is a comfort in that. It levels the playing field. In the crypt, the emperor and the pauper are exactly the same. They are both quiet. They are both at peace. The empire built on bone did not last. No empire built on suffering can last. Nature always reclaims what is hers. The jaw returns to the dust. The crown returns to the metal, and the spirit is finally free from the pack. The shadow that haunted them. The entity that lived behind the tongue has no home in dry bone. It needs blood. It needs life. When the Habsburgs died, the parasites starved, so the crypt is not a place of horror. It is a place of liberation. It is the place where the monsters finally left the building. And now, bring your attention back to your own frame. Feel your own bones. They are strong. They are quiet. They support you effortlessly. You are not carrying the weight of an empire. You are not carrying the weight of a curse. You are simply resting. Your jaw is relaxed. Let it hang loose. There is no tension there. Your hands are open. There is nothing to grasp. The history book is closed. The heavy cover falls shut with a soft thud. The dust settles in the library of time. The king is sleeping. The empire is sleeping. You are safe in the sanctuary of your own room. The past is a statue in a museum. You can look at it, but it cannot move. It is still. Everything is still. Take a deep breath. Let it go. You are built on peace. You are built on rest. Close your eyes. Sleep now. Sleep.